Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I know that some of our participants are still on their way at the security checkpoint, but hopefully they will join us any minute. So hello, I'm Radvilė Morkūnaitė Mikulėnienė. I am Deputy Speaker of Seimas and Head of European Affairs Committee. And I'm very happy to meet you all here today. And thank you very much for Madam Ambassador Inger Buxton for having that conversation, I think several months ago, when she said, look, we have to organize something together on a very important topic, ongoing topic, which needs to be discussed, and many decisions need to be made on gender equality, and especially what is a heartache, I think, for all of our societies. It's still quite a big amount of violence against women. So for the past year and more, I think we all lived through different times as we gather here from the Eastern Partnership countries. I think we all very much affected by the war in Ukraine, and one of the painful dots and heartaches is, I think, particular violence against women. So this is very broad thing. One thing is domestic violence in general, but the other thing is assaults by occupiers and assaults against women and children. We all know the scale of mass deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia and many other horrible things, but this is most probably the other theme. But why am I mentioning it? Because I think that our main focus was on war. Nevertheless, we still have our things to do and our problems back at home, and especially in those countries that feel certain social unrests and many other things and are affected or were affected by the war in previous years. So the other aspect is COVID, of course. Now it seems that, like, some tiny problem which was very long ago, and really the war has all our attention. But according to all surveys, and all data, the domestic violence has increased during pandemic, and I think we all still remember what a difficult time for our families it was. So. This, our gathering since yesterday and lasting today, is meant to exchange the views, to hear our friends and colleagues from different countries. I'm very happy that there is such a broad representing from many countries. So I'm happy to invite our first colleagues who would open this conference, and then later on we will meet on this presidium and we will hear experiences from different countries. So let me invite Madam Speaker of the Seimas, Viktorija Čmilytė-Nilsen, please.
Thank you, dear Radvilė. Good morning, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, members of parliament, representatives of civil society, dear ladies and gentlemen. It is really a pleasure for me to welcome this distinguished audience and such a broad participation in the conference dedicated to the question of gender equality, to the question of combating violence against women, sexual violence, domestic violence, the things that are still plaguing many of our societies despite the many advancements of the past years. In the last 15 months, all of us have been living in the context of Russia's aggression on Ukraine, and that, of course, has brought the question of violence against women to a new level, into focus once again. In fact, we are living in very, I would say, strange times, dualistic times. On the one hand, in the countries of our region, in the countries of Eastern Partnership, and more broadly in the countries where the fight for democracy is still ongoing, women tend to become leaders, relentless, brave, courageous, and it's enough to look around. We see the 2020 democratic movement in Belarus, spearheaded by 3 women. Today, Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, the leader of democratic Belarus, lives here in Vilnius and works from here. We see Moldova led by Maia Sandu, a great democratic Western leader who is bringing her country on the European way. We see, well, very recently I had a chance to welcome Madam President of Georgia here in Vilnius. And I could go on and on telling you about what we all know, that women assume the positions of leadership under the most difficult circumstances. At the same time, women are also disproportionately affected by the crises. And the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression on Ukraine, is one of the most painful reminders of that. But even there, women are not only doing extraordinary miracles to safeguard their families, they're in fact fighting on the front alongside men in tens of thousands and showing in this way miracles of courage and self-sacrifice. Of course, when we see this, it may lead us to think that other problems pale into insignificance, but that probably should not be the case, and we must continue in each of our respective countries fight a struggle to safeguard women from violence, from domestic violence, from sexual violence, something that unfortunately still this data stands firm that 1 in 3 women experience at least once in their lifetime. And here in Lithuania, we have had certain successes in fighting domestic violence. More than 10 years back, we have already adopted the law combating domestic violence, and it has brought a lot of results. The most important of them is that it stopped being a silent problem. It stopped being something that one is ashamed to talk about. It brought the problem at the forefront, to the surface, but it does not mean that the problem is solved. In the past years, we have also had quite some initiatives in the Parliament strengthening gender equality, strengthening the possibilities of women to pursue their careers, combine their family duties, so to speak, and other interests. And well, among them, many social initiatives, but also I would mention in terms of protection, criminalizing of stalking. That was also an important move. Of course, I cannot, seeing many familiar faces from the civil society among the audience today, I cannot not mention the elephant in the room, the Istanbul Convention, something that unfortunately Lithuania is still one of only 6 countries to not have ratified. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that the recent decision by the European Parliament will act as a further impetus for us to move forward. And to be honest, I am certain that it will in one way or another. So it is just a matter of time before the unnecessary fears about the Istanbul Convention will be dispersed, and that we will also become a party, a full-fledged party to that important convention, also aimed at protecting the rights of women, at safeguarding women from violence, and helping them enjoy their rights to the full. So, having said that, I'm really grateful to Radvile, I'm really grateful to Madam Buxton, Her Excellency, for putting this together and for giving us a chance to talk about important themes. And I have no doubt that today's conference will act as one more reminder to the society of Lithuania, also that the question of violence against women, the question of gender equality is an important one, is still something that we need to progress in. And looking forward from now on politically, I am convinced that it doesn't matter when the elections will take place, this autumn or the next one, but I hope that there will be more and more women, more and more young people in the parliament, and we will take the decisions that need to be taken in order to enjoy more gender equal, more just and more protected society. Thank you so much and all the best.
Thank you, dear Victoria. I am just wanting to remind everybody that there is an interpretation. So it's Ukrainian language, Lithuanian, and English. If someone is in need, please use this. And yes, please, the initiator, I must say, Madam Ambassador of Sweden, Inger Buxton.
Thank you, Radvile. Madam Speaker of Seimas, Excellencies, Members of Parliament, friends and colleagues. I am indeed very, very happy that we can organize this conference and that everything has come together to deal with the important issue about violence against women, and particularly in situations of conflict and crisis. And we are organizing this as a Swedish EU presidency conference, underlining how important we see this topic. And this conference would not be possible if we did not have the cooperation with Seimas, as well as with the European Institute for Gender Equality and the Lithuanian Center for Equality and Advancement. It is through this cooperation that we can bring about this conference today. I would also like to thank the European Commission and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, who have also supported this conference financially. Exactly 15 years today, on the 26th of May 2008, the Eastern Partnership was first proposed by the Polish and the Swedish foreign ministers. And the aim was to strengthen and deepen the relations between the EU, its member states, and the 6 Eastern European partner countries. The work over the past 15 years have laid the foundation for closer partnership and for EU integration. I am therefore very pleased that we have representatives with us from all 6 Eastern Partnership countries, from EU member states, as well as some other countries that are very active when it comes to human rights, and of course also the EU institutions that we have with us today. And a special warm welcome to all of you who have traveled far to be able to come here. And I know that some of you had quite a difficult journey with cancelled flights. So an extra warm welcome to you, of course. Gender-based violence presents a critical challenge in both the EU and the Eastern Partnership countries. This violence permeates all aspects of society. And we know that in times of crisis, as well as we saw during the pandemic, as in times of armed conflict, the level of gender-based violence tends to increase. And we know that 1 woman in 3 is experiencing physical or sexual violence sometimes in their lives. Many of you who participate here today, you work on a daily basis with the victims and seeing what the violence does to the individual, to their children and close family, as well as to the wider society. This is literally a question of life and death for many victims, and a question about their fundamental human rights and their right to live in dignity. Addressing this violence against women and girls must be on top of the political agenda. And this is why the current EU presidency trio, the French, the Czech and the Swedish presidencies, have chosen gender-based violence as one of the priorities issues for our trio presidency declaration on gender equality. So why are we organizing this conference? The aim of the conference is to better understand the nature and extent of violence against women in Eastern Partnership countries and in EU member states, and particularly the impact that crisis and conflict situations have on the level of violence, as well as the structural problems of gender inequality in society. To raise awareness and underscore the need to prioritize this on the political agenda as a critical and pressing issue in all our countries. To increase knowledge on how governments and organizations are addressing violence against women across sectors, including lessons that can be learned, identifying existing legal and policy gaps, and tools for implementation. And as well, to facilitate contacts and networking among participants that can hopefully lead to the development of an EU Eastern Partnership network on gender equality. And I'm very happy to see that I think with the conference that or the pre-meeting that the civil society had yesterday at EIGE served as a good opportunity to actually start that networking and forging new contacts. Currently, we see the progress in the fight against gender-based violence in the EU being on its way, with the proposal for a directive of combating violence against women and domestic violence, and also the recent vote by the European Parliament to authorize the Council to ratify the Istanbul Convention for the EU to become party to the Convention. This is strongly supported by the Swedish EU presidency and the Swedish government, as the Istanbul Convention is the international benchmark and gold standard convention in this area. During the coffee break, we will also have time to explore this interesting exhibition, Gender Equal World, Shaping New Realities, that is just outside here. And actually one of the participants is also featuring in this exhibition, and she will introduce it a little bit later. So finally, I hope that you feel that this conference will bring some extra energy and new knowledge to your ongoing work, and that it can also strengthen cooperation and networking between organizations and institutions working on this issue. And also at the end of the day, that this can lead to give dignity and rights to those women and girls who are particularly exposed to violence in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, and thank you for your nice work in strengthening our two countries' relations. It's really a big pleasure and a very nice thing. In Lithuania, we have only one European institution, I think the smallest agency, but nevertheless very important one. And let me invite the Director of European Institute for Gender Equality, Karlin Schele. Please.
Dear honourable members of the Lithuanian Parliament, dear ambassadors, civil society representatives and colleagues. It is a great pleasure to open this conference surrounded by critical actors playing an active role in combating violence against women in times of crisis, conflict and beyond. The past year has been particularly difficult as we are at a confluence of crises that are interlinked. Between armed conflicts, natural disasters and climate change, and new threats such as online hate speech and cyber violence, there is one constant. Women, children, youth and elderly face higher risks of violence, exploitation and economic hardships. This was a key topic of concern and conversation in EIGE's Gender Equality Forum last year, looking at where crisis and gender-based violence meet. What it comes down to is facing these challenges by developing solutions and action plans to prevent and tackle the gendered impact of crisis. To put this into focus, due to climate change, 1 billion people are at risk of being displaced across the world by 2025. 1 billion, imagine. Of those billion, there is a gendered impact. More women than men will face greater hardships, some of which are unspeakably cruel and unjust, like domestic violence, difficulties accessing basic sanitation, and economic vulnerability. As I mentioned, climate change sits among other crises, like the ongoing war in Ukraine. In times of peace, approximately 35% of women worldwide experience gender-based violence. But in times of crisis, this number swells to an alarming 70%, according to UNOSHA. These violations can occur for women fleeing conflict, be that in the countries of origin, during their journey, in transit, or in the destination countries. And gender is one part of it. Violence intersects with social class, religion, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Imagine the experience a lesbian woman with a migrant background faces. The level of discrimination for simply being who she is, where all she wants in first instance is safety and stability. Now, in the context of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, a very fearful and uncertain layer is added for the most vulnerable to navigate. IGE's recent study, as part of a project where we are collecting and mapping information on healthcare services that are available for women and girls, shows that women and girls fleeing the war in Ukraine are confronted with barriers to accessing their sexual and reproductive rights in host countries. Traditional gender roles, structural barriers, and prevailing stigma still hamper women and girls from accessing their human rights. But international legal frameworks are the foundation to respond to and prevent gender-based violations in conflict and crisis. The Temporary Protection Directive issued for people fleeing Ukraine is a promising example of how we can collaboratively respond to crisis situations. On a wider EU level, the Commission's legislative proposal on combating violence against women and domestic violence will help to enshrine standards in EU law. And beyond, the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the Istanbul Convention, known as the gold standard, is a powerful framework on how to achieve gender equality through prevention, protection, prosecution, and integrated policies. And let me unpack this a bit more. Prevention. Gender inequality needs to be addressed at its roots, and that means overturning power imbalances which maintain these inequalities. Protection. Women's specialist services have done remarkable work in protecting victims of gender-based violence and advancing human rights. Partnership, recognition, financial support, and knowledge exchange should be central to our future cooperation. Prosecution. Rape and sexual assault is a weapon of war. Perpetrators must be held accountable. Victims and their families must receive the reparations and compensation they deserve. integrated policies. lygybė has been a steadfast support to member states with its evidence. Our Gender Equality Index has been proven to help influence the design of effective and inclusive policies. However, in addition to legal frameworks, we need a political will to develop clear action plans and strategies. We also must find innovative ways to disrupt power imbalances that prevail in our societies and challenge long-standing structural and institutional injustices. We can do this by learning and leading from each other's expertise and best practices in the areas of gender-based violence. And therefore, I'm grateful to the Swedish presidency for putting gender-based violence so high on the agenda. If in such a high-level political setting, gender-based violence is a central focus, then that reason alone is compelling enough to get everyone around the table to speak our corporations into action. We are stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very constructive and informative your appeal to all of us and to your speech. And now I'm making a trick. I'm removing my card. And here we have Sofia Kaltorp, who is Ambassador of Sweden for Gender Equality. So she will be the moderator of the next panel. Thank you very much. I still will be with you in hall or during the whole day, time to time, and I hope we will have a chance to have a chat. But thank you very much. Have a nice event, fruitful discussions, and please, dear Sofia.
Thank you very much, Ravile, for that introduction. Good morning to all of you, and a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with friends and colleagues. I'm the Swedish Ambassador for Gender Equality, and I will just now be joined here at the stage by some incredible civil society activists from all the 6 Eastern European Partnership countries. And we will kick off the first panel of this seminar that will be focusing on violence against women in situations of conflict, instability, and civil unrest. And as we have heard today, just as an introduction, of course, gender equality is a key aspect for the development of our societies in all ways, social, economic, politically. And just, we heard our ambassador to Lithuania talking about Swedish priorities during our presidency, and gender equality is one of the key issues that we are pursuing. We do believe that without gender equality, we will not be able to achieve the goals that we have set up in terms of economic, social, and economic development. So to see and hear now, listen to and discuss with those that have the real experiences from gender equality and violence against women in the 6 Eastern Partnership countries, I think will really be a great way to kick off this day and to start a discussion on how we, together within the EU and with our friends and colleagues in the Eastern Partnership countries, can really advance and deepen our work in terms of gender equality and fight against fighting violence against women. So with those quick introductory words, I will turn to my distinct panel. As said, we have representatives from all 6 Eastern Partnership countries, and they have been asked to talk about what are the key issues in terms of violence against women in the respective countries, but also what has worked and what has not worked. I think in order to see how we can move forward, we really need to to grasp what has worked and what has not worked on the ground. So that will be a second topic that we will unpack here today. And then thirdly, lastly, looking of course at recommendations. How can we as a collective do better in terms of fighting violence against women and pursue the agenda of gender equality within the EU and within the Eastern Partnership. So I will start with my first panelist, that Knarik Makrikan, who is the co-founder of the Women's Agenda in Armenia. A warm welcome to you, Knarik, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished members of the Parliament and colleagues. It is a very huge honor to be here today in this event that brings together these many experiences to explore the main challenges that women face in Eastern Partnership countries. The no war, no peace situation that we currently have in Armenia, which is directly connected with unresolved Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, gives bigger significance somehow to security issues that we currently face in country, which somehow leaves behind the gender agenda. However, while talking about the gender-based violence and challenges that women face, the first must to be mentioned issue is domestic violence. Even with the domestic violence law in place, still, due to the lack of shelters, the mental and psychological security of violence survivors is not fully safeguarded. The law enforcement and implementation processes are poor and needs amendments as well. The situation is exacerbated even more by the second Nagorno-Karabakh war and following displacement. And especially women that are directly affected by the conflict appear in a particularly vulnerable situation because of lack of access to resources, increased family burden, lack of information, stereotypes, and failure to recognize violence. Women's organizations also flagged about increased femicides. Another form of violence facing women is psychological violence, which is the least visible and identifiable type of gender-based violence, yet is one of the most spread types of violences in Armenia. Despite the scale, the offered psychological support is not enough to cover the whole scale of problems that we currently have. On the other hand, because of the stereotypical mindset and priorities given by post-war situation, the mental health and well-being is not a priority for women. The issue of sexual violence is still remaining a red flag. The lack of sexual and reproductive health and rights education, taboos, double victimization, and gender stereotypes silence victims, and many cases and acts of violence remain unpunished. If we are talking about gender-based violence, it's very important to always remember the violence against women human rights activists and human rights defenders. Gender disinformation triggers a huge wave of hate speech and discriminatory narratives. Obviously, women's organizations are part of this discriminatory attitude as well. Economic backlashes facing women are also an important issue of concern. The study shows that there is still 23 to 28% of a pay gap in Armenia between women and men, which obviously is a huge obstacle to gender equality and justice, and it's a factor that leads also to gender-based violence. Of course, it's very important to talk about what has been done so far. Civil society, and especially women's organizations, conduct advocacy campaigns and put huge efforts to combat against gender-based violence. Due to the collective advocacy campaigns and constructive collaboration with the government, it was possible to amend domestic violence law, and soon we will have better protective and preventive mechanisms. In 2019, the government adopted our first national action plan on UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Last year, the second national action plan was adopted, which is obviously a very huge step towards the protection of rights of women directly affected by the conflict. Women's rights organizations offer legal support, psychological support, they have awareness raising and capacity building interventions. And despite the backlashes, disinformation, and many other challenges, the civil society, in a good collaboration with the government, continues implementing important steps. I would like to conclude my speech with the notion regarding the rise of anti-gender movements and anti-gender sentiments, which actually require our joint steps to really push forward the gender agenda and combat against gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Knarik, for that very interesting outline on the situation in Armenia. I will now turn to Shala Ismail from Azerbaijan. Please, Shala, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to share this panel and to share the agenda on the women's rights situation in our countries. What we are having in Azerbaijan now can hardly be explained within the 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. Well, when it comes to the gender-based violence in Azerbaijan, just going to the figures, which can be mentioned is in 2022, we had 1,475 cases of domestic violence, and this is more 7% more than the previous year. Only within the 4 months of this year, there were 23 women murdered in Azerbaijan. Last year, the whole year, we had 79 women femicides, cases of femicides. You might think that this is not a lot, but it is. It is a very big number, and it's actually the biggest number in our region when it comes to South Caucasus. What is the most important thing is that even these figures, which are quite huge, they are not the concrete statistics, because we do not have the data exactly showing how big the situation is. The figures which I'm mentioning are based on the media monitoring and on criminal chronicles of the Ministry of Interior, but we do not have the fixed system of data collection, which does not show us the bigger scope of the gender-based violence in Azerbaijan. When it comes to the types of violence, of course, as in many other countries, only physical and sexual violence is very often regarded as violence. We don't have this psychological and economic violence regarded as types of violence. That's why it can hardly be identified within our society and also by the government. When it comes to other consequences of the violence as such, if we just take one area, that's reproductive health and rights, I can say that unfortunately just one consequence indicator is sufficient to show how bad implications we are having. The sex-selective abortions, you know that there is this sort of negative phenomenon in the world, and more than 23 million women were unborn only in last year, yet that's a global figure. Azerbaijan shares the very first seat, so it's a negative first. Azerbaijan has been a leader in this bad indicator. We have the highest rate of sex-selective abortions in Azerbaijan. Is it the indicator? Yes, it is, because it is a direct consequence of the gender-based stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and the violence. It is a crime. Do we have sufficient mechanisms to prevent this sort of phenomenon? I'm afraid no, because as I said, we don't even know how bad the situation is, since we don't have the concrete data. When it comes to the situation, what can be done and should be done, at the state level, we have the gender-based, we have the law on domestic violence, which was adopted in 2009-10, and the National Action Plan on its implementation came only 10 years later. We are happy to have it, but yet we still have several national action plans which are in the row but are not adopted for many years. One of them is National Action Plan on 1325, another one on gender equality. We keep pushing the adoption of these national action plans. We also keep pushing the adoption on the law on family planning and reproductive health, which, as I said, is instrumental for prevention and protection and response to gender-based violence, yet we are having it in the parliament in the pending status for 14 years. What are the opportunities? I would say that one of the biggest opportunities probably are those international frameworks on human rights protection and women's rights protection, which we have, and one of them is CEDAW Convention. And Azerbaijan had the latest dialogue in June last year, and we have received the biggest number of the recommendations ever obtained by Azerbaijan so far. So these are 85 recommendations in 22 areas of concern, which is approximately 15% more than the previous dialogue meeting. the domestic violence recommendations constitute more than 20% of the entire recommendations. So the GBV-related recommendations are dominant, of course, in the CEDAW. We still do not have the Istanbul Convention on the table for the signature and for ratification. Unfortunately, there is still no political will for that. And one of the gravest points, which I would say that deteriorates this whole situation, is that the lack of civil society engagement in the whole process, for the mere reason that in December 13, we had the unprecedented crackdown on the civil society in Azerbaijan, which definitely affected all areas of intervention of the civil society. So practically there is an unfavorable environment, operational environment in the country, which is visible at the level of registration, operation, and funding. And the women's rights organizations are as affected as everyone else, and unfortunately we do not have the organizational capacity to show the sufficient level of resilience to this situation. There are, of course, many initiatives which are undertaken despite of these hard circumstances, but we are calling at every possibility to request the support of the international community to bring our decent space for operational environment back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shala, for that, and of course, in particular, to highlight the importance of international frameworks. And we heard from the speaker of the Seimas mentioning the Istanbul Convention. So that is, of course, very important to see how this international community, with our different instruments, can support all of you. And with that, I then turn to Julia Mitchevich from Belarus. Julia, you're the co-founder of the Feminist Group of Coordination Council, but you're also the member of the contact group on Belarus within the Council of Europe. So please, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, our partners and colleagues. It's a really big honor to be here and present what we have in Belarus. Belarus as a state remains the only country in the Eastern Partnership program and one of two countries together with Russia in the whole region where there is no legislation on combating domestic violence, as well as there is no any kind of gender-based legislation at all. In 2018, it was an initiative of different civil society organizations to make a law concept on the prevention of domestic violence together with Minister of Internal Affairs, but unfortunately in the last moment it was blocked directly by the President Lukashenko, who called this initiative as the bad influence from the West, which runs against our traditional values. And however, the survey was conducted by the UNFPA in 2018, showed that at least every second woman in Belarus suffering at once in their lives from the psychological, economical, sexual or physical violence. Before the revolution in August 2020, it was mainly a task for our civil society organizations like feminist, gender or women who did a great job for making awareness campaigns, advocacy campaigns, who support women suffering from the domestic violence. But unfortunately, in 2021, all these organizations were administratively liquidated and had to move Belarus. Hundreds of women today, as are staying in prisons. Thousands of women, unfortunately, had to move country because of the unprecedented level of the political repressions against them. They did it alone or together with their families and children. Today we can constate that Belarus as a state represented by Lukashenko's political regime is a main abuser and a violence has become socially approved as a state level. Today we can say that there is not only local legislation on domestic violence or gender equality. There is no one shelter for women. There is no any unified database on domestic violence samples, what we can see. All the organizations that before 2020 was working on this issue and problem, now fortunately many of them can reopen in different countries, and they established, for instance, online hotline for women, Belarusian women who live abroad and continue to live within the country. Me and my colleagues, we can establish a feminist group within the Coordination Council, and last year we did an online survey together and in cooperation with our partners from Swedish Liberal International Center, Vilnius office. And it was a survey on domestic violence, and there is no time right now to say all the results about this, but just some specific cases that we got from this survey, that there are some women suffering from the domestic violence who were blackmailed from their partners or husband, that they could call to the police and tell them about this women's participation in the protest in 2020, what would mean that these women could be arrested. And that is the reason why women don't go to the police and don't show their stories openly. As well as because they can't trust the police and any kind of state authority institutions, as I said before, because of this huge violence on a state level towards people and women in particular. And there is one more problem and challenge that we faced right now together with all those activists and organizations who continue to work with this topic and issues, that unfortunately for our democratic political leadership in exile, gender equality and women's rights are still not priority topics, and they still don't have this in their agenda. What really very influence on the negotiations with the donors, construction of grant support programs, what has a lack of financing and resources as a consequence. Just the last point, Thanks to this event and all the international support from our sisters in Eastern European partnership countries in European countries, we can say and tell our stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for sharing that very moving account of the very, very grave situation for women and human rights activists in Belarus. And we will come back to you and to see how we as international community can strengthen our supports to our fellow sisters and activists in Belarus. But I now turn to our next speaker, that's Dr. Yulia Karashvili from Georgia. Who is, among other things, the co-founder of the association Consent in Georgia. Please, Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Thank you for opportunity to be here and to talk with such respectable audience. For Georgia, it is now very important to seek international support for candidacy status because we see it's like opportunity to continue our democratic reform and to continue to make our government accountable and transparent. We always were proud that Georgia was the country which first approved law about domestic violence still in 2006, which first ratified Istanbul Convention and first proposed first national action plan on the resolution UN Security Council Resolution 1325. It's very difficult to talk after Julia, it's emotional speech, but I will try. So what is very important that we do have a framework in Georgia, legal framework, which helps us a lot, of course, to work. But regardless of all institutions which we have, and since 2017, we have special institutional mechanism dealing with domestic violence and violence against women. And when Georgia ratified Istanbul Convention, 29 laws were changed to answer to requirements of this, which was very important, and it gives some opportunities. Recently, answering on 12 priorities which European Union put like precondition for candidacy status, and one of them, the 9, was about gender equality and dealing with domestic and violence against women. And there were already several very important initiatives like special measures for women's political participation were continued until 2032, and some other concepts were approved by Georgian parliament, like economic empowerment of women, which is very important to deal with roots of domestic and violence against women, because we know that poverty, increased poverty and instability always is one of the roots. But as representative of IDP Women Association, I want to stress importance of situation when country is in protracted conflict, unresolved situation, that is also is one of important route for increasing of violence against women and domestic violence, violence against elderly, because of economic reasons, because of still existing poverty. And regardless all efforts of government from one side and civil society, still number of cases which are registered is not decreased. Last year, 6,000 of deterrent orders again were issued. This during 5 months already 2,700 orders are issued, which means that still the Hydra, the Dragon is here, and we need to continue to deal with this. What are the main sources which we do have in civil society, which we continue to use? During the COVID time, when there were special measures introduced for women, like it was special SOS button which you could use in telephone immediately to call, to inform police if you were with perpetrator and could not call. But again, it was done for women who had access to internet and who had good telephones, which could be supplied with GPS. It's very important. And rural women, women living in remote communities, internally displaced women, women living alongside the line of conflict division. They not always have this opportunity. So we were going to create, and we created resilience groups in communities because we thought to provide resources and opportunities to women who are the most vulnerable in communities is one of means to make them like informal leaders, to raise their authority, and it's informal way to deal also with the violence. So, for instance, women were initiators to do disinfection in centers, IDP centers, and in communities when it still was not done by government yet. So we were raising awareness about women's capacities on the ground because we thought it is a very important part. What else was done by civil society? Small economic incentives. Unfortunately, these very good initiatives which exist both in governmental shelters and in shelters run by non-governmental organization, and we have here very strong anti-violence network, they need to be sustainable. And it's one of problems which in all our countries we deal. Women's organizations are always financed in the last hand, and women's organizations on the ground are financed even in the last hand. And so it's something given for activities, but not really for core activities, not really for being sustainable and to provide services. And the NGOs till now in all our countries are the main providers of services still, and they are trusted, which is very important. Returning in events of February, March, when suddenly was introduced law about foreign influence, and when civil society and Society of Georgia was protested, and fortunately government heard us, and they heard us against after the massive manifestation which was done by women on 8th of March in Tbilisi and in all regions, showing power of women who were not politically engaged maybe at this moment, who were simply saying that they want to continue to be independent, democratic and European. And it was a voice which next day led that the law was withdrawn. So it showed that civil society has the resource, but this resource should be made stable, sustainable and supported. And here European standing together with us, behind us and together with us is very important. Very recently, it was influenced, I continue what NGOs were doing. I have 1 more minute. Yes, yes, thank you. It was introduced digital resource, which provides by one of very important NGOs, Fansuhumi, which provide women with all resources and services available in country. It is very important, but again we go to situation where not all women, and especially women survivors of violence, women living in remote communities, IDP women, women affected by conflict, have less accesses. We were talking today, and Shala was talking about situation with abortion. Yes, it's also issue, and especially it's issue on our separated territories, when, for instance, in Abkhazia, officially it's prohibited to do abortion, even if it's by medical reasons. So, and women were coming to Georgia covertly to do it, and with COVID, when it was for 2 years, closed all the roads, it was quite difficult. So COVID, of course, influenced very seriously situation. And once it started this war in Ukraine, it's also brought back all trauma and all situations in communities of people who survived the war. It's very important to take into account. It's why nation plan to which Women's Society was very much advocating on 1325 is an entry point also to deal with domestic violence, with violence against women, with gender-based violence. And we see it like very important preconditions on work on gender equality and on fighting with domestic violence and violence against women. It's very important because in our understanding, unresolved conflict also is one of ours. It was proved by many studies, including World Bank study, that the most physical violence is going in villages alongside the conflict division line, and the most sexual violence and sexual harassment is going in IDP collective centers. We will have some recommendation, which I was say later, not to take time from my colleagues. But thank you again for this opportunity, and we hope that our common work as Eastern Partnership country and as Eastern Partnership countries and EU will continue.
Thank you very much, Julia, in particular for highlighting the importance of bridging short-term interventions with long-term capacity support. And I think that's a very important point we will come back to during the discussion. But now I would like to turn to my next speaker, that's Veronica Teluka from Moldova, who is the coordinator of the National Coalition Life Without Violence in Moldova. Please, Veronica.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. Hello. I'm from Republic of Moldova, and I'm leading one of national network in Moldova, Coalition Life Without Violence, a network of 21 organizations, most of them working as service providers in gender-based violence and domestic violence. And as I could hear from my previous colleagues, we all women have an individual experience, but most of us experience collective trauma and collective challenges. And Moldova, in this sense, it's not so different from other countries. And I will start with some data. So, as Madam Ambassador mentioned before, every third woman experienced during her lifetime a form of violence. And in Moldova, we have 73% of women who faced violence during their lifetime. 45 persons in Moldova think what victims are responsible for violence that happened. 55% of people think what violence, domestic violence, it's a private aspect. 40% think what in case of rape, victims of violence, of rape has to be blamed. And of course we have under-reporting around of 11% of women goes to the state system because they have fear, they have shame, and they are fearing to be blamed. At the same time, the context, patriarchal context of our society, in addition, we had severe challenges related to COVID and post-pandemic period, but also war started by Russia in Ukraine provoked the most huge humanitarian crisis in Moldova, because we have the highest number of refugees per capita in Moldova, and of course this crisis has to be tackled through gender lenses, because majority of them were women and children, and very affected and vulnerable in that situation. We had energetic crisis, we had our political very complex and difficult situation. But at the same time, we have to say what women organizations, and my colleagues mentioned this, women organization frontliners, they are always in front of every crisis. Women know how to face crisis. And service provision in Moldova provided by women organization, feministic organization, 60% of service provision are done by feminist and women organization at the grassroots level. And as my colleagues mentioned about fundings, it's so important to say about fundings not in terms only of money, but what autonomy and freedom these funds give to you as a women organization to help other women. And if you look at the data, so we have less than 1% of external financial assistance going to grassroots women organization, and this is real concern because it's reduced our autonomy and agency, and it's detrimental for service provision for women and children. At the same time, what I want to say, we have real significant achievements. First of all, Moldova's EU candidate, and this is one of our biggest achievements. We have women political leaders at the highest level. We have a women president, we have women in parliament, we have women in government in the most untraditional roles, Minister of Internal Affairs, for example, or women president. We have a very important law adopted, law of domestic violence, the national program on prevention and combating gender-based violence and domestic violence. And also 2 years ago, we ratified Istanbul Convention, and this year, we as a coalition delivered the first shadow report of women organization as a response to state report. All these results, of course, are not ad hoc results and not done by accident. This is a hard, meticulous work of women organizations, women leaders at all levels, at the grassroots level, at the community level, at the highest level, as political level. That's why, in conclusion, what I want to highlight, what we have to tackle violence against women and domestic violence, not only in the direction of criminalization, but this social problem needs systemic approach and needs very structural approach, and needs women strong movement and organization. This is important why it's important to support women organization, because nothing can be done being isolated only by one organization. We have to be a part of women movement. We have to be a part of women movement at the national level, but also at the regional and global level. That's why it's so important to, first of all, to have support of women organization, to have accessible, flexible core funds for grassroots organization in order to make them able to provide long-term services and specialized urgency services. In the morning today, for example, I was called by one of my colleagues. This is a reality check. I was called by one of my colleagues who say, like, we have a woman with 3 kids and she doesn't know where to go because in her community there is no services available. And I said, yeah, of course we will support from our grant program, flexible program, which is very urgent and very practical one. So why it's so important? This is why it's so important to support women organizations. Secondly, education. And we see what does it mean if we have a patriarchal society. We have to invest in youth. We have to invest in education in all levels. And third, we need support in EU accession. We need support at the political level, as a civil society level, because this is our path, and we are going to this future, and we build together this future. Women build together this future. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that very positive examples of how a political leadership can make a difference that we now see in Moldova. And I now turn to my last speaker before we open up the discussions, and that's Daria Roshukata from the Ukrainian Women's Lawyers Association, JURFEM. Please, Daria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sophia, and dear ambassadors, dear members of the parliament, participants, and our colleagues. It's a great honor to be here and to be heard there about the situation in Ukraine with domestic violence, gender-based violence, and conflict-related sexual violence. We know that war is not only about capturing the territories, it's not only about rocket missiles, it's also about the language of violence and using this language. And violence is also as a weapon of war, like previously mentioned, also our colleagues as well. Ukrainian society currently are witnesses of violence in different forms. It's not only from the occupiers, from Russian Federation, it's also near, and it could be near next to us. It could be the language of violence which we use in our ordinary life as well. And it doesn't matter you are a man, you are a woman, you have risks to suffer from that. But mainly women are faced and have risks to face in the nearest future with a great scale of violence. And on this panel, I actually will stop on these 3 types of violence. Currently, our huge challenge is conflict-related sexual violence, and our authorities has recorded already around 200 cases of conflict-related sexual violence. We do understand that it's not exact amount of these cases, and we expect more and more. But also CRSV is so special for us working with this type of violence because it breaks walls, it breaks taboo, because all people there can talk about that. It doesn't matter you talk about that in Ukraine or in the Eastern Partnership or other countries in the world. If you talk about that, survivors of sexual violence, survivors of other types of gender-based violence, domestic violence, they see this open door that you can tell about that and you will be heard. We have a lot of time, and just I will stop on the main issues which you have for that moment. some our partnership countries, they haven't ratified the Istanbul Convention, but our issue in Ukraine for that moment is implementation of Istanbul Convention. We did this step, we waited for that more than 10 years, but we did it, and I think that European integration, support, and what's more important, cooperation with other countries also help with that. The next issue that we have is lack of trust and confidence that law enforcement agencies and prosecutors and police will help those survivors. We heard that our colleagues also faced with this issue, and we have this issue for domestic violence, gender-based violence in CRSV cases as well. As NGOs, we do understand that we can provide this service for survivors, but we don't want to replace the state. It's so important to remember. We don't want to replace, because if we will replace the state, the system won't work, and it will be more crisis. The next issue is the confidentiality. We faced with this issue during the full-scale invasion, when we saw in media and during the investigation process that all people want to know what survivors of CRSV cases what they suffered actually, what they experienced, etc. But we saw that also traumatized people and come back as to the previous stage. So actually it's one of the main challenge for us. Next is a sensitive communication. Sensitive communication from the state party, sensitive communication from NGOs who provide services. It's regarding domestic violence, gender-based violence, and CRSV as well. The next issue is identification, qualification, and investigation. It's not only about domestic violence and GBV, it's also about CRSV. What I mean about qualification, sometimes we call some actions, sometimes state call it like actions, like a hooliganism, but it is, for example, sexual harassment, it is sexual violence, but it's not a hooliganism. It's another type of accountability as well. And our colleagues also mentioned femicide. So if we call it femicide, it has to be femicide. It's not a hooliganism or other actions according to criminal code. Also, identification of different types of CRSV. Our community, our society, they do understand that sexual violence is probably only rape, but it's not only that. It's a forced nudity, it's threats of sexual violence, and other forms. So we have to inform our society and community what is sexual violence. If you do not know what is it, you have never go to our state, you have never go to the NGOs to tell about that. The next issue is informed consent. Our survivors, if they really want to help the state and to bring accountability, the perpetrator, they go to state. They make their first step in the criminal proceeding for having reparation and so on. But when they faced with challenges of criminal proceeding, they don't understand what actually they can expect and what they have to do. We have in our criminal procedure code that you have kind of obligations and rights, but what this person can expect from prosecutors, officers, from police officers, they don't know. So we have to work on the new concept of informed consent for survivors who suffered from sexual violence and conflict-related sexual violence. The next issue, which we have all of us in our countries, is stigma from society and the community in relation to survivors. And the next issue is lack of data. We can't operate this data in our researches and studies. For example, we have monitored the judicial practice on the first half of the previous year, 2022, and we saw that it is less cases of domestic violence and gender-based violence in country, but it's not about that. It's only about lack of data, and probably it's according to martial law. We have no lot of information about that, because previous week we heard from our colleagues, NGOs, that already they got calls from women who are expecting their men from the military service. They do understand that they will face with a new wave and scale of violence, and just they want to understand how to communicate with these people, because they afraid them already. And the next issue is services and reparations. Actually, we are in Ukraine working currently on the national mechanism of reparation for survivors of CRSV, but we don't understand how it has to be practically implemented into life, because it's also about the status of the person of CRSV and who suffered from this kind of violence, and funding, money, from what sources it could be. So actually we are currently working on that. And probably I will stop here because my time is on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria, for sharing experiences from a, of course, very, very difficult situation in Ukraine when it comes to violence against women. We have heard from our 6 speakers from all Eastern Partnership countries about the individual situation in their countries, but I think there are a few important sort of common threads that I would like to highlight. First of all, the issue of sort of the structural issue when it comes to violence against women, and how all forms of violence against women are intertwined. We heard about the conflict-related sexual violence, the domestic violence, psychological violence, economic violence, and of course the issue of gender norms as an underlying factor. But we also heard about the frameworks, the implementation of frameworks. It's not only the frameworks, but the implementation of them that are important. And then last, I think, Daria, you mentioned the issue of data and how we can make sure that we have fact and figures in order to know what would be the best intervention to address some of those issues. And then, Knarik, I think you mentioned the issue of the anti-gender movement, and I would like to pick up on that, because all of you talked about the importance of working together within civil society, within your countries, but also, of course, across the partnerships and with us here in the EU. So those are some of the main issues that's been raised during this very, very, very rich discussion. And I would now like to open the floor to the audience to see if there are any questions, remarks, or comments to this distinguished panel. We have about 20 minutes, and I would like to take a few questions. Please introduce yourself and your organization, and then I will turn back to the panel to provide some more reflections. So I see one question here, please. You have a microphone on your desk, yes.
Esteemed panelists, thank you. I listened and made a lot of notes. And introducing myself, I am Inete Ielīte. I am a chairperson of Latvian Network of Women's Organizations. We are Coordination for European Women's Lobby, also member of Women Against Violence Europe, and I'm also I'm honored to chair the working group of Advisory Committee on Equal Opportunities for Women and Men at the European Commission on prevention of gender-based violence. So we meet next week to have a debate there. But what I want to say, and keep 2 minutes with me, please. So first of all, congratulations, Ambassador Buxton. Sweden is very well known with coming up with good regional initiatives, very serious issues, but keeping up an eye on implementation and further steps. So I sort of feel that Sweden should be committed. Also, I would like to reflect on what Director Schiele said about actions. So, and there are few that we can easily take on to support our sisters in Eastern Partnership. And as I'm here on the funding of our organization, so we made the first step. So we can have also a few other steps. And one of the things, what I hear, and especially Dr. Karashvili's reflection, that funding sustainable services, funding for human rights, women human rights organizations is a very, very important. And we have had in last years several initiatives supported by Swedish Institute, for instance, in the region. Some other countries, like Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also have gender equality amongst priorities. But we do need to have more collaboration and exploring these bilateral and multilateral funds like tenders and calls from European external action proposals, for instance. Train our Eastern Partnership counterparts and ourselves, the women's organizations here in European Union, to access to those funds. And also a little bit think for the future funding periods, how we can reflect those needs of today in the future fundings. So that's easy. Let's start with some webinars. Let's organize it. I will take initiative for that. In collaboration with our Swedish ambassador in Riga, and hope we have that success. Second one, I think it's very important that EIGE, together with committed Eastern Partnership countries' governments, as ambassadors, have been not only serving us fantastic food, but also committing to the priorities, can work together using EIGE's methodologies, data sets, to harmonize knowledge and have more understanding what is happening in Eastern Partnership. And it also doesn't require much resources. It's quite a low-hanging fruit, I think. We just need that political and governmental will, and of course support from EIGE's management board and director yourself. So last but not least, which is also not very costly, but which has not been visible, at least from my point, is how the situation in Ukraine has been reflected in action plans towards the UN Security Council Resolution 1321. It hasn't been, as I know, in many countries. But we should bring women and peace issues on agenda back on the table. Thank you. Very glad. And the last but not least, we need the government cooperation. We need the working group that collaborates between Eastern Partnership countries and EU partners, especially the Nordic Baltics that are so committed, and Poland, I believe, also is committed to support Eastern Partnership. So thank you very much. I wish luck, and I am open to discussions and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for those very concrete recommendations that I'm sure that we will continue to discuss in the coffee break. I see one more question here, and then one here, and then I will, but please, we have some more time. So after the two of you, I will get back to the panel, and then we will make another round. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Tatiana Tsiba, a member of Parliament of Ukraine, and if it's possible, I will speak Ukrainian, and I will ask to... Yeah.
Of course.
Thank you. Ну, по-перше, хотіла подякувати за організацію даної конференції, за те, що це дійсно дуже важлива тема. Хотіла сказати про те, що до нашої повномасштабної війни Україна досить впевнено рухалась на зближення свого законодавства з законодавством Євросоюзу. Ми ратифікували, як вже сказала наша спікер, Стамбульську конвенцію.
Now it is. Now it is. It should.
Now it is. Okay. Thank you. Please go ahead again. I was just worried that we would not understand you if we don't speak Ukrainian.
So Ukraine was moving towards getting the legislation closer to the legislation of European Union. We have ratified Istanbul Convention. In 2021, it was the first time when we allocated some money in our budget to create some shelters for women that experience the violence. And we've been building those centers out, and a lot of speakers were talking about problems of domestic violence, and this problem began to be not a norm in our society, so we're moving in the right direction. But the war obviously has changed a lot. There were a lot of things that were talked here, so I will just want to add some more. So first of all, during the war, the sexual violence is one of the types of violence that this violence is not done because of the willingness to have sex. It's done as the type of tortures, and that's why in Ukraine there is a huge problem if it's a gender-based violence or not. So, for example, if it's a rape, it's all clear, but what if it's some torturing of the genitalia using various instruments, or if a kid is forced to watch how the sexual act is being done to relatives. It's a big problem, and we all need support in this. Because we want to say that all of those what I mentioned, it's already gender violence, and against that we should have a legislation, explicit legislation, and we do have that need. Yeah. Another big problem that we've got is with the data collection, or with what happened, and the reasons behind that is that a lot of the territory of Ukraine is now temporarily occupied, and another reason is that victims of the sexual violence, they actually themselves don't understand that they were the victims of the violence. So right now, by the end of April of this year, based on the data of our General Prosecutor Office, we had 172 identified cases of the sexual violence. Only 16 were considered in the court. And we're talking about the Russian military here. So only 16 military personnel of Russia were handed the notice to the court. And it's not because those cases are rare, it's just because we have the difficulties of the collection of the information. So we are demanding that our government officials, our Office of General Prosecutor would be working with others to help us collect the data. And this is a huge help, not only to Ukraine, but to everyone, because based on our conflicts, we're going to be able to develop the legislation that's later going to be reusable in other countries as well. And we also are needing some help in terms of providing of psychologists and psychiatrists that are getting the first imprint of the victims, because to make sure that people that were victims of sexual violence, they didn't feel themselves useless, they didn't feel different. So I'm very thankful that we are continuing our cooperation, and I hope we're going to continue it in the future even more. So I hope that we're going to be able to do something really deep. So thank you so much that you raised this topic. Thank you so much that you are helping us in what we have right now.
Thank you very much for highlighting some very practical and concrete aspects of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. And I just would like to take the opportunity to highlight that Ukraine, you revisited your national action plan on women, peace and security just recently. Sweden was part of that, and I think that's the type of ways that we can create bridges between the frameworks and the concrete actions that need to be taken. So thank you for that. I will take two more comments at this stage and then move back to the panel. So we had one here, and then we had you here. Yes, please.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. My name is Anna Zobnina. I am the director of the European Network of Migrant Women. We're a platform organization in the European Union covering 23 European countries, and we are led entirely by migrant and refugee women. A lot of our women would be coming from the countries and the regions where the panelists represent right now. And in this regard, I wanted to ask one question. How we as women's civil society organizations in the European Union, so our office is based in Brussels, but our membership is spread all over Europe, how we can support and build collaboration better, but also what do you think we should be doing at the European level, not just at the national level, but for example, as a platform. We were organizing 2-3 days ago a big protest in front of the European Parliament, and this was dedicated to sexual exploitation as one of the forms of violence against women, in which, in Europe, the overwhelming majority of victims, they're migrant and refugee women. If you enter any area where there is legalized prostitution in Europe, it's the women from Eastern Europe, it's the women from Nigeria, from Romania, from Eritrea, those are the victims. So I wanted to ask how we can collaborate better from our side. We already collaborate with many organizations, including in Ukraine, for example, and our members increased from Ukraine. We now have formalized little, but they need support, refugee women-led organizations in our platform. And the second question I wanted to ask, in terms of trafficking. So we do have a kind of an argument that European Union did so well that there are no victims of trafficking who are Ukrainian women since the beginning of war. We do not believe this, and we know that's not true, but we heard this. And it's true that the European Union, we are, for example, a member in the EU anti-trafficking platform. We cannot deny the fact that I think European Union did extraordinary mobilization in terms of prevention of trafficking, but it doesn't mean that there is no trafficking. And how we can better support, we heard stories from our members who were trying to support women crossing borders when women just disappeared. We do not know where those women are. We had buses disappearing when they crossed the border to Italy, and women handed the photocopies of their passports and their phone numbers, and it was impossible to trace them. The entire bus just went missing. And this is not a singular case. So how can we work better on this? And whether you also have information, especially on trafficking in women from your regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting the issue of trafficking. Obviously, that is a very, very key aspect of the situation, and also the specific issue on how we can work together. But before I turn back to the panel, because I see a man here in the audience who would like to take the floor, and I think that is in particular important, obviously, to also the gender equality is a strive for women and men. So please, you have the floor, and then we come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. So I'm ambassador of Armenia. My name is Sovanes Egityan. But I'm not speaking from the name of man, Just maybe it will be questioned at the end, but I think we need to break mainstream this opinion that fight against violation against women, it's business and obligation only women organizations. We cannot put this fight only for shoulder of women, particularly NGOs or civil organizations, even not on the shoulders of women MPs. I don't know all statistics, but I know in Eastern Partnership parliaments, proportion of women maybe from 20 to more than 1/3 in Armenia. By the way, there is a member of parliaments from many countries, including Armenia here. So 20 or 34 or 35% in Armenia. I think it doesn't mean that this minority must fight or create legislation or conditions to avoid to break such big problem. I'm sure that this issue will issue concerns all members, all men or women in the parliament, in the society. And maybe it may be question, or maybe my wish or wish all others, that I think that men also must be involved or must be in the first line of this fight. And maybe it question, do you have such alien organizations or I don't know, NGOs or just officials in your countries? I don't know about other countries, but for example, in Lithuania, general prosecutor is a woman. By the way, in Armenia as well. But it doesn't mean that in Lithuania, in Armenia, fight against a violation against women must be more active because general prosecutors are women. I think it doesn't matter. And do you think that how we can break this imagination, maybe after even this reportage about this conference, that it's like it's concerned disturb only women, and women only women fight against this. So there are a lot, I'm sure, men in your countries, in our countries, who are maybe can be active as you, sometimes maybe more active, because it's shame to have such problem in 21st century in countries seem to show that they are democratic countries. Thank you very much. And thank you, Inger. It's a beautiful conference. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for that intervention. And I will now turn back to the panel. It's been a very, very rich discussion and many interesting perspectives that's been highlighted. I think the issue of, alliances, partnerships, how we can work better together is really a key one when we are now looking ahead. And as I said in the beginning, my sort of final question, trying to sum up a little bit what's been said to you in the panel, is your recommendation on the way forward. What is now next in terms of partnerships and working together within the Eastern Partnership, but then obviously within your countries, and as was just mentioned here, finding alliances. So I will start with Knarik and then move forward with the rest of the panel. Please, Knarik.
Thank you very much. Thank you for very important highlights and questions. In my recommendations, I will also encompass these questions that were raised. So first of all, I want to start with shuffle my recommendation order and start with sexual violence. We are constantly talking about Resolution 1325, which is legal, from the legal point of view, is a pillar for women, peace and security agenda. However, at some point we are forgetting about Resolution 1820, adopted again by UN Security Council, that actually recognizes rape as a weapon of war. So there is really the need, and the practice shows that unfortunately we need more actions towards also advancing this resolution and creating national action plans. I want to also mention that whenever we are talking about financing, and it's a recommendation to donor community, it's really very important to conduct in the inception phase a needs assessment analysis to understand the real needs at grassroots, to build and design the interventions in a way that they very meaningfully address the issues that women and other communities are facing. It is also important to pay attention to gender responsive budgeting, which is also a very good solution for unpaid work that women are doing in their family structures. Whenever we are talking about correlation between sex and gender-based violence and war, whether we have enough evidence and data and facts-based evidences that can stand and can be used in our advocacy. So we really need to develop more researches, conduct more researches, and develop policy briefs that will help the donor community, international community to understand the grassroots situation in country. There is a need of implementing women's economic empowerment projects, because obviously when we are talking about displaced women and women refugees, the first issue and most urgent thing that women basically face is the economic backlash, especially in patriarchal structure. And there is also a need to adopt women's professional affiliation, because unfortunately when women change their living space, their professional skills become irrelevant in a new environment. For example, imagine a woman living in a village suddenly appears in a city, in a capital city, whether she is compatible to the already existing employment environment. She is not, so there is a need for this adaptive mechanism. And last but not least, I want to again highlight the importance of ratifying the Istanbul Convention, which will move forward will move us another level of combat against gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Knarik, for those very concrete, practical recommendations. Shall I turn to you? What would be your headline in terms of next steps?
Well, any change requires three components. One is political will, another is capacities, third are resources. In case of Azerbaijan, we have always had the resources. I mean, we are all rich country and we have plenty of resources which could have been spent for the development of the country or addressing any issue. The capacities are also there. Even if the capacities are missing due to resources, it's always possible to strengthen the capacities. What has always been missing is political will, the true political will to build up the society with the addressing the rule of law issue, the good governance issue, etc. However, you know that we have very specific situation with Azerbaijan. Any international pressure is always regarded as an intervention into the internal affairs of the country. And this has been taken always very painfully and sensitively by the government of Azerbaijan. So I'm again coming back to the issue how to make it inside supportive enough so that the internal stakeholders are strong as possible and as resilient as possible to make the pushing from within. And I come back again to the civil society situation. Civil society has always been quite a great actor inside Azerbaijan up until December 13. For the whole decade, imagine the whole decade, 10 years, we are in the situation when we can hardly protect ourselves, let alone our constituencies, let alone making any political change inside the country. So that's why I want to use this opportunity and to request and to call for the actors. Do not forget of the other countries in the Eastern Partnership country region. I know that the crisis is there with Ukraine, but I also know that other countries need your support equally as much as Ukraine does. With all my respect and support and fingers crossed for the good news from Ukraine soon, I also call you not to forget about the other countries, and also to enable us, support us, to demarche with us, to win back the favorable operation environment for the countries, for the civil society in Azerbaijan, so that we can do the changes from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Shala, for that. So I now turn to Julia. I hope that you have felt a lot of support for the work that you are doing with your fellow sisters in Belarus. What would be your concrete suggestions and plea to us now on how we can move forward supporting you?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for any kind of support that you're providing for us. It's never enough, but anyway, and I would like to say that I really appreciated what already Knarik and Shahla mentioned, and I join for these words, specifically about Belarus, what we really need. Now we are in the process to make instrument like projects and programs, etc., how to combat on gender inequality and promote gender equality for Belarusian women firstly, and men also, and children, etc. Not only not for those who are living in Belarus, but who relocate, because we can't say it's like only about refugee, but we prefer to say relocates, because we really not only dream, but sure that we can move back to our country soon. And we need to have these programs for both of these living abroad and within the country. For instance, we have Ombuds Office initiative, what is like a prototype of this kind of instrument, and to collect cases of gender-based violence and trafficking and any kind of violence for, as I said before, Belarusians and living within the country and in other countries. And of course, we need to get more expertise, if you have it, how to work with this. And also we need to get a financial support for doing this work, and everything that you can provide with this. And also one more thing, and I would like to say thank you for all the comments, but especially for the last one, because we really need men who do this job and do these actions together with us. And we really need such sort of role models. And please do this and be this for, and maybe it will be, and I hope it will be turned out to our political democratic leadership, that it's mostly male also, to push them priorities, to have gender equality as a priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that. So I now turn to our other Julia Karashvili. Please, what's your suggestion?
Thank you. It's good to be two Julias. In Georgia, it's very rare name. So here we are two on panel. It's really nice. First, I will try to answer two questions. Yes, it is very important to have in national action plans. We do not have it yet, but we are advocating for this because, of course, war in Ukraine strategically changed situation in all our countries, created absolutely new geopolitical situation, created new fears for population in all sides or from division line. And what's the most important, it created situation when other conflict, and especially protracted conflict, practically are not seen as important things to deal with. And it's my great thanks to Her Excellency and to organizers of this conference that all 6 countries are invited and we have the equal opportunity to talk about our problems. I think it's very necessary. To another question about from European Migrants Network. In December this year it will be Global Refugee Forum, and there is also a European Refugee Network which tries to put issue of refugee women in this Global Refugee Forum, because usually there are different issues. So I think it's very important to collect information, to have data about all networks, all organizations which are working in these issues. I personally am a member, and I'm very proud, together with Virginia, of Regional Platform of Women's Peace Dialogue, which is covering all 12 countries of this region, and a member of Action Network of Women in Forced Displacement. And all these networks somehow are dealing with the issue of violence. So somehow to put together data and efforts and to work in synergy is very important, both in local level and not to leave behind nobody also on our separated territories, because there are very strong women organizations and women voices, and we need to give them also space to talk and space to understand us. Very important point which was mentioned by His Excellency from Armenia. Of course, men are, and men sometimes are leading organizations working on gender equality, like in Georgia. We have advisor to president who's advising also on gender equality. It's very good, but what we really need, in all our countries, as Knarik mentioned, there are, and in Europe generally, is this more so-called traditional and conservative issues going up, and what we all together need to do, and where we really need your experience and your assistance, it's to help to our governments not to follow this traditional conservative issues and not to go in the end of such kind of movement, but follow to European perspective and to inclusion, diversity and multiculturalism, which for us is very important. And don't forget that women are leaders and women are experts not only in issues related to very soft questions, but they are experts in transport, in energy, in climate change, and all these issues. And for instance, in Georgia, and I'm sure in many countries, issue of transportation is issue of gender equality and is issue of dealing with gender-based violence, because women who live near the occupation line, she cannot safely travel if it is not transportation provided. And so these issues should be seen by complex. And what we really miss, all of us, is comprehensive approach. We have in Georgia interagency commission which deals with gender equality and with issue of gender-based violence, but still there are issues which need to be in agenda. It's issues of transportation, it's issues of access to resources, about political participation and many others. And when we talk about conflict resolution and conflict transformation, usually it's men think tanks which are working on this, and gender-based violence and violence against and after conflict is not included in conflict transformation issue and agenda. And 1325 is this tool which we can use here, and it should be obligatory in all projects which are, EU took the obligations that 85% will have gender mainstreaming. Where is this mainstreaming? We do not see it yet.
Thank you, Julia.
Yes,
I think that we will move on with the rest of the panels, but I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to talk more about this comprehensive approach in the coffee break. Then I turn to Veronica. What is your
thank you.
your recommendation?
I will also very shortly mention the issue about trafficking, because in Moldova we have also from the beginning we had problems with trafficking, and authorities were very slow, and UN agencies and other international organizations very slow in reaction to women trafficking. So what I think it's important, because these are two connected links, but it needs also a separate discussion, trafficking of women and children, and of course it's important to have support services and support women organizations who are working directly with refugees and migrants to support data collection and to support trans-border capacity building of professionals, and where it's needed space to talk about this issue, which is also connected but also isolated. And about men and boys, Istanbul Convention includes a provision about men and boy engagement and involvement, and it's of course all this manipulation out of Istanbul Convention creates like a artificial division of what men and boys and girls and women were staying separate and they are opposite, but it's not the issue of this. And that's why one of my recommendations concern the education of youth and involvement of youth, both men, boys and young men and girls and young women in non-violent education, in normal relationship, in preventing and combating stereotypes and patriarchal culture of society. This is one of the conclusion. Investment in education, in media also, which is very important, especially social media. Secondly, is we have to be aware, invest in women building and in building the women movement, because obviously just few donors, feministic donors, invest in building women movement, and we see how important it is to have networks of women, platforms of women, groups of women activists and leaders. This is secondly, and also it's linked with support women organization, grassroots local organizations who are working hard and who are expert in their field, and to support them through core support from flexible funds, because it's strange to have 1%, less than 1% of financial assistance going to women organizations and 80% going to implementing partners, whatever it's UN agencies or other implementing partners, international agencies. And this was very obvious in last year and even now in humanitarian crisis. And this is also an issue for donor community, how to ensure to make these EU funds available for local organizations, to make them flexible and not on project-based, but core support-based. And what else to implement? Sorry, just the last one, because it's so important to have women leadership in all spheres, in political sphere, in IT, in transport, in climate change, in civil society organization. So women leadership, it's important, because usually, let's be honest, problems of women are brought by women on the political agenda and social agenda. So that's why we need women in position of power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. We are running out of time, but I will, of course, give the opportunity to Daria to give your sort of key recommendation on how we can move forward from here.
Thank you, Sophia. I will be so fast. Thank you for comments and suggestions. First of all, wanted to react on the question regarding how your organization can help us on the level of the European Union. First of all, thank you for being voices in the European Union institutions. And we are always we are always happy and glad to have this support as well. And first of all, what you can do and what we can do in cooperation with you, it's to be our voices in the European Parliament and the European Commission. Currently, we know that they are working on a green recovery plan of Ukraine. So it's so important to include gender component in the recovery plan, because green recovery, it's not only about green climate change issues and so on. It's also about green values. What actually one members of the parliament can do in the whole European Parliament, but some statements from one European Parliament is also so crucial for us to be heard, even from one or two different organizations. Also joint letters to members of the European Parliament, joint letters with Ukrainian organizations, with European organizations, with the European Commission. We already did it as well. All women's organizations. We sent this letter to European Commission and to European Parliament to react on that. So we will continue to keep this message as well. And we do know that European Union is not ratified an Istanbul Convention, but currently you are on the process of having this proposal to directive on the prevention of domestic violence and violence against women. And we know that it is possible to include also some comments and suggestions regarding the situation in Ukraine and how you will react then in the post-recovery period of time and also now. Also wanted to mention that we thank you for solidarity and support, and more important for cooperation, because cooperation is about actions. And these actions are toward values for which we're fighting all, for which we're fighting for, and we are fighting all. And the last word, thank you. We are always keep the message in Ukraine that it is on time, because we always heard that it's not on time, it's war and so on and so on. But if we will keep this message in your countries as well, it will work. And you know, time is we always think that we have no time for something, but it is important to us to not make mistakes because of time as well, not to do it in a hurry, but to cooperate, to make networks with other countries. And if you are following recommendations from other countries, from our colleagues, it's important to include risks, because as I mentioned before, yeah, it could be a great opportunity, a great experience, positive, but if you not include risk, you can, for example, replace the state or something else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daria. I think you put it very well, that cooperation is about action, and we have this morning heard some very, very concrete and inspiring examples of action from all of you in your respective countries, and also suggestions on how we within the EU can support you and how we can work together within the EU Eastern Partnership on the issue of gender equality. So please join me in a round of applause for all our panelists. It's been really great to have you, and before we take a very well-deserved coffee break, our ambassador Inger Buxton mentioned that there is an exhibition outside, and I will not let you go before inviting the Georgian anti-GBV activist Nato Shavalyadze to come up and say a few introductory words about this exhibition, Gender Equal World, that the Swedish Institute is hosting here. Please, Nato.
Very fast. I know all of you tired so much. It's a very big pleasure for me to be here. It's a great honor to be here among such beautiful and strong ladies and men who has very big sensitive about gender equality issues. And thank you for your hard job, what you did and what you will do. I am Nato Shavalyadze. I'm from Georgia. I'm from Tbilisi. I'm head of a non-governmental organization, Anti-Violence Network of Georgia. we established in 2003, we opened first shelter for domestic violence victims in Tbilisi, in suburb of Tbilisi. We have crisis center, consultative center in the center of Tbilisi. We have 6 subcommittees and 10 regional committees in whole Georgia. We organize training about domestic violence and violence against women for patrol police officers, for teachers, for social workers, for medicines, doctors, and etc. And we wrote training models for police academy. We are author of new 5 big package about new law, which one adopted by Parliament. And we are co-author of also about domestic violence law, which one adopted by Parliament in 2006. And we started new program for economical empowerment women. It's very important, all of you know how it's important to be economical independent when you are victims of domestic violence. And I'm very proud that we have very good friends, and without of their support, without of support of international organization, we did not get this result what we get. And I want to tell you about few words about this exhibition, which one is very interesting for me. And when I get information about this exhibition, it was very big surprise. This very famous lady from Sweden, who is a famous photographer, she made pictures a few years ago in Stockholm. And when I get information that the name of this exhibition is 15 Heroes, it was a surprise for me, and first emotion what get for me, it was I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed so much because what I did and what I do, it's natural work for me, it's natural situation, what I am thinking that what I did and what I do, it's everybody can and have to do. But when then I thinking about it, I understand. When you can survivors' lives, people, it's very important. And when you have good co-workers, good persons, good friends, around of you, it's very important. And I'm thinking not only me are hero, all of these people, all of you, what you do, it's very important. And when we feel we want to change society around of us, and when we want to see society without violence, and when we have condition to do and change something, it's very important. And when we get a result, all of us, we are heroes. I'm sure it's true. I hope, I'm sorry, I hope in future we get not only Georgia and Russia Georgia and Ukraine without a war, because it's very important for whole world to be together and thinking about war without violence. And thank you for invitation, and thank you to be here, and good luck all of you.
Thank you, Nato, for those very inspiring words that I think was a very, very good end of an extremely rich and interesting and inspiring discussion. So thanks to all of you for being here. Please enjoy a coffee and the exhibition, and I think we should reassemble here at 11:20 in order to start the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry that
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Lithuanian Parliament and the Human Rights Committee, which I happen to chair, it's my pleasure to welcome the Swedish EU Presidency Conference on Gender Equality and Violence Against Women here in the Lithuanian Parliament. Welcome, everybody, once again. And you know, here in the Lithuanian Parliament, we have a big problem. Everyone likes to talk a lot, and sometimes it's very difficult to manage the MPs. Today I'm not going to follow the suit. I'm going to be very strict with moderation rules and apologize my fellow panelists. We will do our best to fit this panel discussion in the next upcoming hour up to 12:30, so we can proceed with the conference timely. In the first panel discussion, we have heard about possible ways of combating gender-based violence against women and girls through cooperation and assistance in the Eastern Partnership countries. However, it is always very important to reflect critically upon our self-image and ourselves. The EU and its member states are far from perfect in preventing gender-based violence, protecting victims, and prosecuting offenders. 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced physical or sexual violence, mostly perpetrated by intimate partners. And I'm sorry, but this is not acceptable. Currently, there is no specific EU legislation addressing violence against women and domestic violence. However, the issue is still covered by some of the EU directives and regulations, in particular in the areas of judicial cooperation in criminal matters, equality between women and men, and asylum policies. To be perfectly clear, the EU institutions are already working towards addressing this critical situation. A few weeks ago, the European Parliament ratified the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the so-called Istanbul Convention. That is the benchmark for international standard in this field. And I really liked the references in the previous discussion, as the Istanbul Convention was called the golden standard. While this is an important step, the ratification is applicable only to the areas that belong to exclusive competences of the EU, and as many as 6 EU member states are still struggling in ratifying the convention on the national level. Unfortunately, Lithuania is one of them, and the reasons behind not ratifying the convention in Lithuania that I have personally heard as the chairman of the Human Rights Committee goes beyond my imagination. The Council and Commission are also negotiating the Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. The proposal aims to ensure a minimum level of protection across the EU against such violence. The new rules will criminalize a range of offenses, including female genital mutilation, FGM, or cyber violence. However, we have to be mindful about the risks of watering down this proposal, as some of the member states are extremely reluctant in granting EU the additional tools in fighting against gross human rights violations against women. So what are the questions, the main pressing questions for today? What direction are we moving towards on the EU level, and what are the most pressing challenges? What is the role of the national governments and the civil society organizations in ending violence against women and girls across the EU? Fortunately, I have a very well-equipped panel of speakers with experiences both at the EU institutions, national governments, and civil society organizations in addressing these pressing questions today. Thank you very much for being here today to share your perspectives and insights. Now I'll use the opportunity to represent each of you and provide you a 5-minute time slot to present your position and the point of view upon the raised challenges. After that, we will sum up the discussion. I will follow up with some questions, and then, of course, we will open the floor for the questions from the audience. If you don't have any objections towards the proposed time manner, I first, therefore, present the first speaker on the panel. That's Barbara Tardon, Senior Advisor to the Minister of Equality of Spain, most notably perhaps sharing the perspectives of the national government in addressing the issue of violence against women and girls. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much, dear members of the parliaments, dear ambassadors, especially the Spanish ambassador, dear colleagues, and of course, dear friends. In 1977, after 40 years of dictatorship, the first democratic elections were held in Spain, making possible a new scenario in the conquest of women's rights, which has been held hostage for more than 4 decades. Since the beginning of the Spanish democracy, gender equality policies, and especially sectorial policies on violence against women, have been progressively woven together, consolidating a legislative framework that is a benchmark on the international agenda of women's rights. But all of us, we know that still much remains to be done. The old patriarchy that justifies and protects impunity for violence cannot be undone in 1 or 2 legislatures. We need decades to achieve this. The process, also, I want to stress, has not been easy in my country. The regulations and public policies aim at preventing and eradicating the different forms of violence against women, all the forms that all of us we know, sexual violence, physical violence, economic violence, or even feminicide in Spain, have been gone through different moments and political decisions. The possibility that female victims of survivors of gender-based violence are today's central political subject in the north of my country has only been possible thanks, and I have to be very honest and strong with this, to the feminist political movement, both the autonomous and the institutional, to women's and human rights organizations, and of course, the institutional political decisions that have been taken in Spain over the last few decades. From 2004 to the present, Spain has developed a response model to combat violence against women, based from my point of view in 4 aspects. First of all, consider violence against women as a state issue and the protection of our obligations in the international human rights framework, to anchor the fight against violence against women in laws and public policies, whoever governs. Second, allocate adequate budget to public regulations and policies for the eradication of all forms of gender-based violence. Third, shield the resource and specialist care service for all victims who suffer any form of violence, including their children, to move towards their excellence and towards some fundamental thing that I always like to point out, to improve the working conditions of the professionals who, as I always say that in all the places where I go to speak, my colleagues, the women that work in specialist service, they save lives, like just as health professionals do. This is a huge challenge in all countries or region. And finally, of course, listen to the victims, their needs and their demands. We institutions must adapt to them, no they to us. It's our responsibility as bearers of obligations and their rights as rights holders. They must know that we are with them. They are not alone. I don't want to end my speech without stressing something very important in this historical moment, in this region. We have immense challenge ahead of us as a region. We cannot let our guard down in a context of very conservative reaction. Whatever progress is made on rights, the reaction against it is always disproportionate. We know it, because we are aware that the progress made can reserve in seconds. But if violence against women is not central to the political agenda in the countries of our region, our democracies will remain incomplete. There will never be real democracies if half of the population has to continue to live under threat of some form of violence. We all know it. All women that are in this room know it, because we have all lived it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for outlining the key aspects of ensuring effective response to gender-based violence on the national level. And these 4 aspects, I think, we should be once again repeated: is identification of a gender-based violence as a state priority, allocating adequate resources, ensuring accessibility of services, and listening to the victims. My follow-up question is, do you think, is there any hierarchy in these priorities? Could you rank them from the most important to the least important, or all of them has to go hand in hand?
I think all of them has to go hand in hand. But I think it's so important. This is something that I learned in the last 4 years as part of the government, because I come from the civil society. I'm feminist and activism. I come from the civil society. I've been 20 years with women that have been suffering gender-based violence. And I know something that I learned during this time in the government. We need budget. We need a budget. Doesn't matter if we have the best laws, and it doesn't matter if we have the best public policies. If we don't have budget to implement them, it's impossible to continue fighting against gender-based violence.
Thank you very much for making this very clear. Now I'll move on to our next panelist in the session. It's Evin Inger, the member of the European Parliament from the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in Europe, originally elected in Sweden, and, as I understand correctly, working actively on the directive on preventing gender-based violence across the EU. Please, Erwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to start with extending a big thanks to the Swedish Embassy and Ambassador Inger Buxton, and of course also the hosting country Lithuania for the invitation and for organizing this very important discussion. Well, there is quite a lot to say on gender-based violence. First of all, I always get saddened when we organize conferences and then we see a lack of interest from men also to join the discussions. It is essential, it is important. Sorry, there are exceptions, and we are happy for that. But in order to eliminate this heinous violence, we also need to do it as a society at large. But for it to happen, the society needs to start seeing women's and girls' rights as human rights. Because only then we will be able to protect, to prevent, and persecute those behind the violence or those that are committing this heinous violence. That over 50 women in Europe and 50 women in Europe are being deprived their lives every week as a consequence of domestic violence is not acceptable. Women are being killed just because they are women. That 1/3 of the women have experienced gender-based violence is unacceptable. So it needs to be recognized as a human right for the society to together act on it. I am happy that there has been good steps taken recently, not at least as it looks like the EU will be ratifying some part of the Istanbul Convention, but as you also said, it's a very small and limited part of it. I wonder how big difference it will make. Nevertheless, it's politically very important. It's a political sign that things are, even though slowly, things are moving forward. The big challenge will now be to ensure that the directive on violence against women and domestic violence in the EU will also be adopted. And me and my colleague Frances Fitzgerald, who will be talking soon also, have had the honor to become the co-rapporteur for the directive in the European Parliament. And of course, we are doing everything we can to ensure that the directive will be as strong as possible. Because just a couple of days ago, we were notified that the Council have their final stand and conclusions, but they will be adopted sometime in the beginning of June. But if the proposal from the Council as it is goes through in the Council, it has been very much watered down from the original proposal that was put forward by the Commission. While the Council and the Member States seem to want to water it down, we in the European Parliament are of course striving to strengthen it. Then the negotiations in autumn or late summer and beginning of autumn will take place, and there of course we will also ensure that whatever decision will be in the end, the conclusions from the negotiations, there will be a directive, a legislation that actually, not only in theory, but also in practice, defend women and girls all across our European Union. But former Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jan Eliasson, sometimes say, "The world is home, and our home is the world." And I think that really summarizes how the struggle for gender equality also needs to be conducted in the European Union as well as externally. The struggle must go hand in hand, because when we see a backlash in some part of the world, we also see a backlash in our own union. When we see a backlash in our own union, we see a backlash also globally. It goes very much hand in hand. And we also know that this violence takes place at home. It even takes place, I should say, in politics, at schools, on streets and squares, in war, but also during peace times. So gender-based violence doesn't see time or room. It is for us time to ensure that we are consigning it to the dustbin of history. Because of that also, we have, and we will be concluding also the Parliament's decision during the summer, try to strengthen it further. It is, for example, very saddening to see that the rape paragraph, the consent paragraph, is out. In Sweden, the country I come from, just a couple of years ago, we introduced in our country the consent paragraphs. We also have a gender equality, for example, agency, to ensure to strengthen the work within the country. We also have strengthened the punishment for those committing these crimes. When some member states actually takes good steps forward, the European Union cannot be the one, and the Council on a European level cannot be the one trying to water down already pretty strong European Commission proposal, even though, of course, from the Parliament side, we want to strengthen it further. So it is sad to see the proposal that is public right now. But I can just say that we will I can promise that we will be doing everything we can to strengthen it forward, and we will also be able to achieve this goal the best together. Politics and civil society needs to do it, and that needs to be done hand in hand. We are strongest together.
Thank you very much, Evan, for outlining the important work that is being done in the European Parliament regarding the adoption of the directive. My follow-up question is, the timing is the key, and we are facing the European elections next spring. So most probably, how do you feel, is there any political pressure about lagging short behind of time in adopting it, or is still plenty of room of actually making the proposal into the EU legislation? What is the general atmosphere about this proposal?
I know that Francis also will be talking about this, but I just can say that we are doing everything that we can to ensure that we are holding the timeline as well as possible, because in spring we will go into election mode as it is during the spring before the elections, or the month before the elections. And unfortunately also, we need to be aware that after the elections, or what is good, I should start with, is that during the autumn we have the Spanish presidency that we also look forward to, and then we will also have Belgian presidency that we also look forward to. But after the Belgian presidency, then we have Hungary and Poland, and we unfortunately know that Hungary haven't ratified the Istanbul Convention and doesn't have any intention. And in Poland, the government, after Turkey left the Istanbul Convention in June 2021, I think it was, or May, June 2021, then the Polish government said that they also declare that they will be leaving the Istanbul Convention. So it's two countries that unfortunately do not want to put gender equality, feminism, women and girls' rights in the center of the policy making. So we are trying to do our best to speed up our process.
Thank you very much for this clarification. And now I will move on to the third panelist today. It's Frances Fitzgerald, also a member of the European Parliament, from the group of European People's Party, originally elected in Ireland. Also, please present your perspective on the topic.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much indeed. I must say I really enjoyed listening to the panel earlier, but I was also very saddened, as I'm sure most of us were, to hear the stories and the journeys that you are all on, that we've all been on together. I've been on that journey in Ireland for 30 years, and I went into government from being an NGO and leading Irish women's organisations and became Minister for Justice. And I want to take up a point that Evan made. The first point I would want to take up is the partnership between NGOs, civil society and government, how absolutely critical it is. I introduced the concept as Minister for Justice of coercive control and consent in relation to rape. I could not have done it. The atmosphere, the social attitudes, the cultural attitudes would not have changed if we hadn't had this huge movement by the civil society organisations and their work. And so I think that partnership is absolutely critical. And we heard from so many NGOs today, civil society organisations, about your needs. And I hope the directive will address many of them in terms of the detail of the kind of assessments you need to do for victims of domestic violence and gender-based violence, the kind of resources that are needed for the organisations dealing with them, the leadership that's needed at member state level, and so on. So I would begin by thanking the Swedish presidency, as they deserve a round of applause for what they have done on the Istanbul Convention. It's fantastic because we have waited 10 years for that. And it does show you what I would call gender-responsive leadership can do. And I think that is at the core of much of what we're discussing here, because leadership has been defined by men, the traits of leadership have been defined, gender has somehow been excluded, and it's been a very hard journey to bring in that gender-based lens. And I would say there's two concepts I'm very interested in and I feel are useful to keep in our heads and our brains, and that's unfinished democracies and unfinished economies, because we have both. And we do not, as women, speak enough about the unfinished economies, because the loss to all of our economies, not to mind the deaths that Evan has spoken about and the physical harm, the loss to our economies is enormous because of gender-based violence and gender inequality. And IGA have done brilliant work on naming that and what the amounts of it are. So I think it's a very useful tool for us to use even more and more, because people care about economics. Harder to get them to care about gender-based violence, actually. But, you know, we must bring the two together. I think that's really important. And I would also reiterate the point about male champions. We absolutely need more male champions, and that is part of the cutting-edge agenda now for men to move into this space and take ownership at a leadership level in relation to it. So to move on to the directive now, we're at a critical stage in the discussions, as my colleague has said. The Council have published a paper, their most up-to-date paper last week. It's on their website for those of you who want to look at it. There's a lot taken out. Rape has been taken out. I'm told it's not so much because it's rape, but because of the criminal justice implications across the member states, that it is going too far in terms of an overreach by the Commission. Now, I ask you, is it an overreach to have rape in a directive on violence against women? I would say it is not, and that it has to be central. But isn't it interesting that the legal basis has been used as a space? And we all know about the space that I've been Minister for Justice. I know the spaces where legal arguments can be made. But actually, I would make the point that we really need to question this. And we pride ourselves in the European Union, don't we, on our values, which are really important. We pride ourselves on being leaders in equality, and we are leaders. But yet, we can have 16, 17 member states saying that you cannot have rape in a directive on violence against women because of the legal basis. So that's very, very critical. So we may well end up, to be absolutely realistic, with a directive that's very strong on cyber violence, that's very strong probably on female genital mutilation, that's very strong on the services that NGOs need on prevention, protection, and even prosecution, but without some very critical central points that we feel should be in it. Not to speak about other areas, for example, like prostitution, which is not in the original Commission paper at all. So you can see that still, in relation to gender equality and dealing with this issue, that there are many challenges ahead. And we must work together, we must network together. This is absolutely critical. And I'll quote a colleague of mine who says, "The degree to which the member states will support, oppose or dilute the proposals it contains will not just determine the outcome, but will also provide a contemporary measure of our worth as women, the extent to which the EU considers that this issue merits the kind of extraordinary, transformational intervention that has characterised the Union's growth and development since the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And I think that sums it up. And I would say that we really need to reinforce the point made in Beijing in 1995, women's rights are human rights. We need to fight for what that actually means in all of our member states, in all of the countries of Europe. In all of your countries, in order to get the kind of changes that we need legislatively, which are really important because they set the base, but then we have a lot of work to do after that as well, in terms of the implementation of the Istanbul Convention and in terms of the implementation of the directive as it proceeds. Let's hope we can get to it within the next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. I really was inspired by your idea about unfinished democracies and unfinished economies, and by the talking point that it's easier to get people talking about gender-balanced economies, the gender-based violence. And I guess in order to address these challenges, we need to talk about the gender balance lens on the topics that we discuss politically. Would you describe the processes that were happening on the EU level, both in the Parliament, in the Commission, in the Council, as developing that gender lens, or actually not putting too much effort in identifying it?
Yes, I think it is a priority of this Commission. Ursula von der Leyen has done very good work. So we've seen the Istanbul Convention, we've seen the gender pay finally being dealt with in terms of transparency this year. As a directive, we've seen the directive on women on boards. That's all very important. But I have to say, and we have a high percentage of women in the Parliament, and I've always said if you have a critical mass of women, in whatever setting you're in, that's very influential. And we have 40%, I think it is, in the European Parliament. It's very high. In Ireland, it's still 22%, which is extraordinary. But in many member states, we just don't have that critical mass. But let me say, I'm still amazed at how difficult it is to get a gender lens, for example, and Aige will know this, into, for example, budgeting. Very difficult. We have to fight very heavily. When the funds were being given to the member states this year, we proposed very strong gender lens on budgeting that the member states would have to adapt to, but we didn't get it in. We got some reference, but not strong enough. And just this week we had a debate on women in defence, peace and security, and we were saying how much, particularly, of course, given the situation in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, that we need to have that lens in those areas of security and peace. And we have seen great improvements, there's no doubt, at UN level. We've seen the Swedish presidency pushing for that and others. But it's amazing how difficult it is when you get into the specifics to get that gender-based lens. Even with good political motivation, it still takes a lot of work, would be my overall feeling. But I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist, so we keep going.
They say a pessimist is the actual realist, but let's hope it doesn't fulfill its calling. I think we have heard very interesting perspectives from the national governments and the European institutions, and I think now it's time to move on to both international organizations and civil society organizations. Before I would like to give the floor to the fourth panelist today, is Jonathan Makler, Executive Director at Coalition Abolition Prostitution International. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. So first I would like to thank Sweden again for organizing this event and also for putting the issue I will address today, which is prostitution, as a priority during its presidency. I think it's really important to have champion states on that matter. Also, of course, thanking the Seimas, the EIGE, for putting this event together. So I represent CAP International, the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution, which is a coalition currently made of 35 member organizations operating in 28 countries, all grassroots and survivors-led organizations. Last year, collectively, our members supported more than 17,000 prostituted persons in the world, mostly women and girls, and mostly from the most marginalized groups. So we are thankful to be invited today to talk about this particular form of violence against women, which is prostitution. On the ground, we observe that women and girls in prostitution systematically belong to the most marginalized and vulnerable groups in society. As Anna mentioned earlier, of course, women fleeing war, as we see right now in Europe with the Ukrainian women fleeing war, but also poor, migrant, discriminated minorities, women from discriminated minorities, make up almost the totality of those in prostitution. They have, in addition to that, most of them suffered from violence, often sexual, before entering prostitution. And they are victims of many forms of violence, including physical, verbal, sexual, and psychological violence while in prostitution. Thus, we observe that there is no such a thing as a free and forced prostitution. In reality, the sexual act obtained by sex buyers in prostitution is always coerced. Either it is coerced by the physical coercion of a pimp or a trafficker, or either it is coerced by the socio-economic coercion and the patriarchal coercion that pushes the most vulnerable women and girls into prostitution. So if we look at the comparative responses and approaches that have been implemented in the different countries on prostitution, it's important to have an objective, an objective and clear view regarding the impact of the different models, and in particular in countries that could consider amending or modifying their legislative models. Certain countries have decided to make a dissociation between this so-called free prostitution, reframing it as sex work and legalizing it, and a so-called forced prostitution. And in these countries, the same detrimental consequences have appeared, both in terms of addressing the demand, protecting victims, and combating trafficking networks. So the first impact of this approach, of the regulatory sex work approach, has been to make the demand, the male demand for the purchase of sexual acts, explode. Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain have become hotspots for sex tourism and human trafficking. Germany is now commonly referred in Europe as the brothel of Europe, and 1 million men in Germany buy sex every day. In Spain, it is estimated that between 32% and 39% of men have paid for sex once in their lives. In the Netherlands, it is now legal for a driving instructor to request a sexual act as a means of payment for his students. It even has a name. It's called a ride for a ride, because if sex has a transactional value, then you can pay with it. In comparison, in abolitionist countries, such as Sweden or Ireland, for instance, surveys indicate that the percentage of Swedish men who purchase sexual acts fell to 7.4% in Sweden, for instance, and 6% in Ireland. So we see the impact of the different legislations. The size of the sex trade has also exploded in the countries that have legalized prostitution, because the demand defines the size of the market. Its value ranges to between 12 to 18 billion euros in Spain, 14 billion euros in Germany, compared to 3.6 billion euros in France, which has an abolitionist approach. And regarding the amount of people in prostitution, it is estimated that right now 400,000, when I say people, I mean mostly women and girls, and mostly foreign women and girls, are in prostitution in Germany. It is also estimated that 350,000 are in prostitution in Spain, compared to between 30 to 40,000 prostituted persons in France, for instance. The legalization has provided a legal facade used by international trafficking networks, as described by many policemen. I want to read very quickly a quote from one of them, who is now an EU expert and who has been in charge of the fight against trafficking for 30 years in Ulm, in Germany. It's Manfred Paulus. He says, in Germany, we now have up to 100% of women coming from abroad for prostitution. It should be clear that a Belarusian woman from the Chernobyl area or a Roma woman from Romania can never make her way alone to Germany to be in prostitution. The women are trafficked into this country. And in this sector, highly criminal structures have developed. Organized crime controls the business. Today we have noble brothels decorated in marble and stainless steel. This does not exclude that pimps are hiding behind this facade, and behind them some mysterious companies. If we look behind the letterboxes companies that we see, we discover Eastern European mafia gangs or the Hells Angels. It is also proven that in Netherlands, the mafia has controlled the business as the municipality of Amsterdam have expressed different times. And then, as a result, it has led to an explosion of violence. Of course, I will not talk about, again, because I don't have time for that, about the inherent violence of the purchase of a sexual act. But one of the main arguments to legalize prostitution was the so-called risk reduction approach. But if we look at the results, for instance, in France and Germany, and in Sweden and Netherlands, we see that, for instance, Sweden has adopted an abolitionist model in 1999. Netherlands have adopted a sex work model in 2002. In Sweden, there has been no killing of a woman in prostitution since 1999. In the Netherlands, at least 30 women in prostitution have been murdered in the prostitution system since that date. If we compare France and Germany, from 2016, 15 prostituted persons have been killed in France. It is way too much. If you look at the same data in Germany, 56 persons in prostitution have been killed in the legalized system of prostitution in Germany. So we have to look at the systems that generate the most violence. There is an alternative to the legalization of prostitution, which is the abolitionist model that fully decriminalizes women in prostitution, that provides exit pathways. In France, for instance, to date, since 2016, 1,247 women who have been in prostitution have received support through an exit program that includes financial support, housing support, vocational training, psychological support, a residency permit if they are foreigners. It can last up to 2 years, and we have a 95% rate of success, meaning that at the end of this program, these women were not in a situation in which they would have needed financial or socio-economic support. This is real change. Penalizing sex buyers. It is an obligation to all countries that have ratified the Parliament Protocol to discourage the demand, but we will not discourage the demand only with sensitization and leaflets. There has to be a balance between sensitization and repression. In France, almost 8,000 sex buyers have been arrested since 2016, and in Sweden, I know that about 1,000 sex buyers are arrested every year. It has a big impact on the size of the demand. And then fighting against pimps and traffickers, reinforcing this fight, and of course trying to change the mindset within the population. So this is why we recommend, because we're in Lithuania, so I will talk just very quickly about Lithuania and end on that. We know that in Lithuania, buying sex and pimping are already criminalized, but unfortunately, women in prostitution are still criminalized under the law. So we support, actually not our own position, but the position of the Lithuanian coalition of women's rights organization called Lithuania Without Prostitution, that calls for the decriminalization of women in prostitution, the provision of exit programs to help them emancipate from the prostitution system, the increase of the penalty against sex buyers, and a more proactive repression for law enforcement against pimps and sex buyers. We hope that in Lithuania, but also in all Eastern Partnership countries, such a law will be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for explaining the impacts of different models on regulating prostitution with a view of ensuring women's rights. And also, this is we had a very productive exchange of ideas yesterday about the Lithuanian model, but my question is more broader, stretching to the EU level. Do you imagine that at some point in the future, European Union could opt for a unified model, how different member states ratify the legal framework on prostitution?
Thank you for this question. And after the previous interventions, how to answer that? We hope that. Thank you. We hope that at some point the debates around prostitution will be less ideological and more factual. I think the debate is intoxicated by a very ideological, ultra-liberal vision of prostitution as a form of work, as if sex could be theoretically a kind of a service provision that could be included in the market. This is a very ideological position that has no connection to the realities we observe on the ground. So, for instance, if I take the case of the anti-trafficking directive that will be discussed in the next month, the European Commission's proposal proposes to penalize only the knowing use of what they call sexual services from a victim of trafficking, meaning that it would mean that we should criminalize sex buyers only if we manage to prove that they knew that the person was a victim of trafficking. If you look at the results of the countries that have implemented it, you see that it works nowhere. It has led to 0 conviction in Germany since 2015, 2 in Finland since 2017, 3 in Bulgaria. So, if we want to arrest 1 sex buyer per year per country, yes, that's a good way to go. But if you really want to discourage the demand, you have to implement the models that concretely help to arrest sex buyers and to change their mindset. So, what I think is that we will manage to have a unified, a harmonized vision, an efficient vision on prostitution when we'll have a more factual, concrete debate on prostitution, giving the word of women who have been in prostitution and to the organizations that are really working on the ground.
Thank you very much. Now let's move on to the last, but definitely not the least, Pille Kopagan, Executive Director of our Women's Support and Information Center from Estonia, talking more, I guess, about the actual groundwork in assisting victims of domestic violence on the national level. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it seems that it's always easy to be the last one in panel because everybody have told all my talking points. I just agree and say that let's go forward. So let's see what I have left here. Yes, attempts to keep human rights in the focus in the States is always very, very tough work, and it is somehow constantly overseen, like MEPs previously said, that getting women's rights into discussion is crazy struggle. So all stakeholders, as we as CSOs, and I'm speaking on behalf of many women's organizations, not only in Estonia, but generally in Europe. And we are warmly waiting and welcoming the new directive text. We really hope that, consent in the terms of rape is out from directive, but hopefully nothing else is getting erased from it, because otherwise we are getting legislation that does not really help us. That yes, Istanbul Convention, it is there, many countries. I'm using this as a crusader, as a Bible, when I'm fighting my fights inside Estonia, that how do you ensure that convention is used? But yes, all texts in Europe have to have strong feminist focus, and definitely prevention is one very important key that has to be and has to stay in directive, and also pushed by not only civil society but everybody who can actually have discussion in state level. Because if nothing else, like we know that when human rights approach does not work when in discussion, then money could work, especially for politicians. EIGE has calculated the price of violence for all countries in Europe, so I strongly suggest looking at the data and encourage member states to keep prevention in the directive, because it is cheaper for country to prevent. Then, yes, directive itself, as I understand now, there is a chance that having clear distinction of competencies between general support services and women's specialist support services in the directive, it is a must. Because we see when states getting their budgets limited, and first that is getting erased from budgets of women's specialist services, because it can be put together with something else. So we can have, I don't know, it's very far-reaching, but yes, we have shelters for homeless people. Let's get another floor and put women there, so we are having under same roof, under same management. It would be ridiculous, but I know that there have been discussions like that. So clear distinction, but in the same time, the effective cooperation between general support services, women's support services, and all other stakeholders who are having contact with survivors of abuse is very crucial. This will be legally coherent with the Victims' Rights Directive, as well as Istanbul Convention that is getting exceeded. And then, yes, building on expertise of us, grassroots people, feminist CSOs, who have been, as I said, we are fighting to keep Istanbul Convention first in our desks, and second, how it is going to be implemented, how it is implemented. In Estonia, I can say that, yes, we have all articles in our different codes and different legislation. How is it actually implemented is totally different story. Like we have I can't now remember good example, but yes, we have legislation, implementation is like, yes, not there. We know that not all states have the political will to ratify Istanbul Convention or support the directive. But yes, human rights issue, let's keep pushing it in addition to fiscal issue. And that our feminist CSOs will continue to be key players. In the discussions, we are canaries in gold mines. We see how and what goes wrong when something is turning. When pandemic started, women's need for women's specialist services increased drastically, but in the same time, our budgets were cut very much. And the same happened in either military conflicts or wars. It always happens that the need for service increases times and times, but there is no money for it. So we need clarity in the articles. We need recognition of our role. We need budgets to get line for our specialist services, definitely. And understanding that women's support services are complementing all other services. So in the end, it helps everybody. Yes, and I just come as conclusion. My conclusion points, keeping prevention in directive definitely, actively including women's specialist services and distinguishing their competencies with general services, partnering with feminist CSOs, as said previously, and I totally agree, find more vocal advocates, especially male advocates and young men advocates, who are giving constantly message about ending violence against women and girls, ending locker room talks, ending abusive language, like we as support center people, we do not like actually was a word nudging that is here, because that is heard more and more, that everything is getting nudged to somebody, because we see the same language in courtroom. The abuser doesn't hit, the abuser nudges a little bit. So that's, and then ensure that abusers are held responsible for their actions, and that is absolutely must. Again, in the cooperation with women's support services, not on shoulders of women's support services, but currently this is very much missing from the discussion. We have victims and we kind of know that they need to be supported, but the abuser is some gray somebody. Nobody knows, does not look like me, and nobody really works with them. Thank you very much. Open for discussion.
Thank you, Pile, for your intervention. I really enjoyed one of your phrases saying that Istanbul Convention, you're using it as a Bible. I guess some of the opponents would say that is a blasphemous statement. But when talking about the ratification of Istanbul Convention, and I know that you played an active role in encouraging the Estonian government to do that, during the discussions, for example, here in Lithuania, we sometimes end up in narrative that the ratification of this international document would solve the issue of gender-based violence overnight. We have to ratify, and everything is going to be perfect, right? Well, of course, everyone in this audience understands that it's not the case. It's just a set of guidelines that we follow in a long journey toward eliminating the violence. Do you think there is a need of actually changing the discourse on the Istanbul Convention in this regard, and how did it work in Estonia?
I don't think it is need to change this meaning how it is, because there are many conventions that human rights activists are using, whether it's Convention of Children's Rights or Victims' Rights, but it is something that we can always, as civil society or also woke politicians, use as something that you see we have to go forward with it. Okay, we have legislation. What do you want? What more do you want? But this legislation is not working. So we have Convention Article 31 and 29 that had these disputes of, child support money. Disputes in courts, custody disputes, child support disputes, where women are getting victimized right and left constantly. So, but it is against the Istanbul Convention. So we are able to negotiate. It takes extremely long time for me as impatient person, but getting to change not only legislation but also behavior of judges to start accepting that such a thing is, that we have to do it. So, but yes, it's not a miracle medicine, but it is a tool that we need, definitely, because without it, there would not be any hope. Now Estonia has, first time in history, Estonia has new parliament, and new coalition agreement includes 2 lines extremely close to me, and I know I work crazy to get it there. One is that to get actual legislation actually working in line with Istanbul Convention, and getting consent-based rape legislation into Estonia. So it have taken so many governments and so many years since 2017 we ratified it to get it actually into political will to start changing. So it still takes time, and it's not that it is solved, but this is a start, and that we can use as a tool, and that's how it is. So come to Estonia, we talk.
So, dear fellow panelists, I have good news. We have 2 minutes ahead of time. That allows us to take 2 questions from the audience. Please raise your hands, introduce yourselves, direct your question to the specific speaker in the panel or any or all of the panelists. I already see 1 hand. Are we going to have a second one? Okay, no. Okay, and the second one. So and maybe we take both questions all at once and then we respond to that. Please go forward.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And first of all, I want to celebrate all the panelists of both this and the previous panel. And I want to express appreciation of everything that you're doing, that you've been doing, and that you will be doing. The stories from the last panel that we've heard from different countries are very touching. I know that the experiences might be different, the levels of fight that we have to take, as you said, as crusaders, and are at different intensity, but all of us are facing difficulties, and this is all very much shared. I want to say to all colleagues who spoke on the during the first panel, and thank you very much for your work that you're doing, and the experiences that you were sharing and what you have done. I also want to thank the Swedish government and for organizing this conference, and also appreciation on their leadership of gender equality and violence against women, and bringing this topic, this issue, on the top of the agenda in the international arena. So, to trying to keep it short, but I have to share some of the experiences, some of the practices that Armenia has taken during the recent years in trying to foster a more equal environment for women and to empower women to be more active in socio-political life. And one of them is the amendment to the electoral code, where we have quota for women, so each third on the list of parties should be of a different sex, so gender, and practically we have 34% of women in the parliament now. And the second, and I very much attach importance on this, is the notion in the electoral code that if the decision-making body of a party has beyond 40% of women, like the bureau of a party, then the party gets much bigger financial support from the state. So this is also very important in not just bringing in women, but also bringing them to decision-making positions. We have amendments to maternity law, and we have amendments in providing more funds to women who want to go back to work even before their kids are 2 years old. So now the state is providing support to women so that they can help, so that they can have more money for supporting their child care. And lastly, before my question, I want to say that we spoke a lot about men's role in speaking up about women's issues and violence against women. And I want to say that I'm so proud that our Prime Minister is a feminist, and I just want to share an idea, a message from his address to women on March 8th this year. So what he says is that there is a lot of resistance to the topic when we speak about increasing or enhancing women's role in socio-political life. People say that women in Armenia should be should be the pillar of the family. They should attach all importance of what they do and their efforts to the family. But this is also right for men, and nobody speaks about that. Men are included in political life, in security structures, in defense. Nobody says that they also have to spend more time in families. And he says that, so March 8th is not about that women are fragile and have to be taken care of, but that women do and can do much more. So with this I conclude, and I just have to ask a question as an MP coming from a country that hasn't yet ratified the Istanbul Convention, but we're on our way, and I very much hope that we will do this soon. So I know that you are coming from countries that had ratified. So I want to ask, what are the challenges that you're facing in this phase of implementation? Because now we're aligning our legislation and with the many of the recommendations and standards of the convention. So I would want to ask, what are the hardships that you're facing in this phase already having ratified, and do you still face difficulties that are related to stereotypes? Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you for your statement and for your question. So the question is about challenges in implementing the Istanbul Convention, and let's take the second question from out there.
Yeah, hello. My name is Madara. I'm from Latvia, representing very hands-on organization working directly with victims of domestic violence, human trafficking. And my role there is to work with gender-based violence prevention, working with adolescents and youth. And therefore I have two questions, if I may. One is about the prevention work was mentioned. So the question is, what are your experiences and, let's say, best practices in your countries when you talk about the prevention and when you actively practice prevention? So how does that look like? And the second question is about holding perpetrators accountable. And in Latvia, we face a huge challenge with exactly this, about the laws and legislations, and also the rehabilitation of perpetrators, or changing the behaviors. So the question is, what is in place and you see that it's not working efficiently and effectively and should be changed therefore, and what is not in place maybe, but you as a practitioner and as an expert see that should be in place when we talk about holding perpetrators accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. It was a little bit of a cheat. It was actually two questions. So we have 3 questions on the line. So first of all is about the challenges implementing the Istanbul Convention, best practices in prevention, and the question on accountability about offenders. So what I would suggest, I would ask for a volunteer to take each question to answer each question one of the 3, and then if somebody will have to ask everything to sum up or add something after the response has been delivered, that will be also welcomed. So who would be the volunteer to take the question on the challenges on implementing the Istanbul Convention? Please.
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the very interesting question. On the implementation part, I think the implementation at large is a challenge per se, and we also need to start from a young age, because men's violence against women starts, of course, also with boys' violence against girls, and it is a cultural change that needs to be done all through society, from schools into working places. When it comes to the concrete challenges of implementation, Sweden got, I think it was in the beginning of last year, recommendations from Grevio on the implementation, and we had 41 recommendations that were put forward. Some of them concerned the children's rights, and also not at least children's rights in shelters, to ensure that also they can follow the mothers. Others concerns, for example, to combat discrimination against vulnerable groups, vulnerable women. So these are a few or two of the concrete examples, but also, for example, women who have drug abuse record, to work with those groups also in a more specific way. So the implementation at large, I think, is a big problem, but we have got 41 recommendations in the beginning of last year. Some of them was this one.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take the question on best practices in prevention of gender-based violence? Please.
Yeah. Thank you. I would say it's always about prioritization. And I think, you know, women's groups, NGOs, CSOs have to work together and have to be very clear about prioritization. And making sure, somebody mentioned it earlier, that you get your, I'm speaking like from, say, a government point of view, that you get your requests into the programs for government. Because increasingly, you know, certainly in Ireland and I think across Europe, political parties work to their programme for government. And if you get your requests and your prioritised requests into the programme for government of the individual political parties and then into the government programmes, that's a powerful lever as a government moves on to get what you want done. I would say the second thing we've learned in Ireland through doing the referendum on same-sex marriage, for example, marriage equality referendum, and this is a very difficult one, but I think there's plenty of brave women out there, is the power of individual voices to get the story across about what's needed. That really was hugely influential in our referendums, and I think supporting those women who are willing to tell their stories and making sure then that it's heard. And the third thing I would say is using publicity campaigns. We've had some very interesting information campaigns targeted at the general public about violence, about cyber stalking, about the laws that are there, and about the role of bystanders. I think that's been very interesting to really say, you know, bystanders can do something. Don't just stand and watch. This is what you need to do. So they're just some general thoughts.
Thank you very much. And the last question on accountability of perpetrators, please.
Thank you very much for the question that I think is so important. And it's a debate in the feminist movement and also in the States. In Spain, we work with perpetrators because the law says that we have to work with perpetrators. But I have to be honest, my point of view, and also the point of view that we have some of the members of the government, is that the work with perpetrators has to be thinking again, because I'm gonna explain an example. Some of us, we went to the psychologist for years without to be committed violence against anything. And work that some NGOs, on some governments, even my government, are doing with perpetrators is so short. And a personality like that, a perpetrator doesn't come suddenly one day and is a perpetrator. It comes from a structure that has to change. All the structure has to change. That means why it's so important, the prevention. And it's so important, the prevention, because I think, from my point of view, the change, the real challenge is to change the culture. If we don't change the culture, perpetrators are going to be perpetrators forever. I was working in an NGO with perpetrators, and my experience is with 17 or 23 sessions of intervention, perpetrators don't change. That's the reality. If we don't change the system, perpetrators are going to keep committed violence against women. This is my point of view. So I think we need to strength the policies to work with young people, with the kids since zero age until university, and of course with adult men. This is our point of view.
Thank you very much. Dear fellow speakers, we are dramatically lagging behind for 12 minutes. Nevertheless, I really enjoyed the discussion. I think we touched upon very different aspects of this very complex issue of gender-based violence. And what really resonated with me, multiple speakers and also interventions from the audience mentioned the need for more male involvement into the topics of gender equality. I counted the number of people in the audience today. We are 9 of us, including myself. So my next wish, when Sweden holds the next EU presidency and we have another gender equality conference in the Lithuanian parliament, we don't have 9 individuals present, we have it half-half. And without further ado, I am inviting the speakers of the closing session. That's the Lithuanian Minister of Social Affairs and Labor, Monika Navickienė, and the Swedish Ambassador to Lithuania, Inger Buxton, to close the conference. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we can.
Sveiki, pavyko. Gerbiami.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the conference. I want to address you in the Lithuanian language to use the services of our interpreters for those who really need it. It is a pleasure to see you, to welcome you in Lithuania. I want to thank the Swedish presidency and the Swedish ambassador for showing Swedish leadership to us, Madam Inger Buxton, for uniting and inviting all of you here, international experts, Lithuanian experts working in the area, to discuss a very important topic. And without solving this problem, other difficult social challenges cannot be addressed either. Violence against women is one of the most sensitive problems in our society, and the numbers are very telling about women in Lithuania facing different forms of violence. 25% of women and 13% of men. So this is what is recorded, and some numbers are unknown, and we do not know the tragic fates of people behind those numbers. A large amount of cases of violence results from sex stereotypes, gender stereotypes, the lack of competencies on non-violent conflict resolution, tolerance for violence that we often have ourselves without even thinking about it or considering it, and also the lack of interinstitutional cooperation. I believe that in order to achieve the change and achieve zero tolerance for any forms of violence in any environment, correcting legal basis is insufficient. We need to make a change inside ourselves, inside our understandings and behavior, and the way we see our environment. And we can discuss what is more difficult, changing legal basis or changing people's attitudes. I think that the second one is much more difficult. But when we speak about situation in Lithuania, during the period of independence of Lithuania, much has been done Lithuania has established the system of supporting violence victims, including information, consulting, legal counseling, psychological counseling. We're improving our system because we really see many cracks in the system. A very important achievement is that since the 1st of July 2023, a new version of the law on domestic violence will come into force with the introduction of new instruments with accredited institutions providing support. Accreditation will help to ensure quality of the services provided and the accessibility and availability of the services in the entire territory of Lithuania. Speaking about interinstitutional cooperation and its strengthening, it is very important that all the pieces of the chains are involved, including childcare services, hospitals, municipal services, governmental sector. Cooperation network should be developed not only on the national but also on the local level. We will also have a new tool, which is the Order of Protection Against Domestic Violence, which will provide for the separation of a perpetrator from a violence victim. The aim of the new law is to protect every person affected by domestic violence, including children that are also victims or witnesses of domestic violence, and to create an effective system of prevention. There's much to be done, but our direction is correct. It is very important to educate the society, to teach people to decipher violence and to educate negative attitudes toward violence and to improve the competences of people working in the network and ensure the cooperation between different actors. The Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor is implementing the program of prevention of domestic violence and support for victims. The action plan actually provides for the tools to reduce the level of violence and improve help and assistance. We're also planning to adopt the action plan for the new period that provides for measures to reduce violence. Another important aspect that we need to speak about today in the area of violence against women is sexual violence as a tool of war, as a weapon of war. And in this context, we have to be strong in our voice in any format that we can. Sexual violence is used by Russia as a tactics of war. UN Expert Commission has proved the sexual violence and sexual crimes committed by the Russian troops in Ukraine. In London, with UN partners, we have agreed to protect the rights of people victims of crimes and to improve their possibilities to get counseling and legal support, to fight stigma, to get the possibility of accessing psychological, medical, health, and other preventive measures. In order to effectively solve crisis, we need to ensure the equality of women and equal participation in any aspects of crisis management, disarmament, negotiations, mediation, and other. I understand and appreciate women's civic organizations and also the activities of the violence survivors. I'm glad that Lithuanian civic society organizations are very actively involved in these activities. After the war was launched in Ukraine, they're collecting all the necessary assistance and sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Fighting human trafficking and help for victims center helps the victims of violence and crime in Ukraine. Lithuania has initiated an international campaign in Lithuania, Rape is a War Crime, which aims at giving information and providing assistance mechanisms for victims of sexual violence. The experts from Vilnius University Faculty of Law also contribute to that, and the Center on Ukrainian Women's Rights Association, Eurofem. I think that this is a very successful example on how a small idea can be made into a big thing. It is also important to say that we need coordinated action in order to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. We need to strengthen justice for everyone and accountability for the perpetrators. We call on Russia for stopping this illegal war in Ukraine. We need to destroy the culture of zero accountability and impunity. Based on the new geopolitical situation and the consequences of the war, we need to strengthen Eastern Partnership policy and to make it a very effective platform of regional cooperation by improving the resistance of the Eastern Partnership region. Increasing social resistance should be our goal number one. Social resistance is based on human rights guarantees that work in democratic institutions and gender equality. In this conference, we have one more opportunity to say out loud that we have many problems that we need to address in our national action plans and on the international level. We need to keep all our focus on preventing and punishing for sexual violence as a weapon of war. Thank you very much for being here, for discussing a very important topic. We have not dealt with all of them. This is an ongoing process, an ongoing effort, and an ongoing contribution and duty for all of us as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Monika Navicene, for being here with us to close this important conference. And also, I would just like to say to all our participants how glad I am that we could bring about this conference, and very much thank you to our co-organizers and with the EG and the Center for Equality Advancement and Seimas also for hosting us here today. But most of all, I would like to thank our eminent speakers and panelists who have shared so much experience and stories about your work. Important work that you have been doing for many years and that you are taking forward, both within the Eastern Partnership countries as well as in the EU, and also to hear about what is happening at the EU level in terms of continue to move forward to strengthen the fight against violence against women. I think we have heard so many important aspects that we have to think about in terms of prevention and to deal with perpetrators. We have talked about the importance of involving men in this work. We have talked about the importance of political will that is unfortunately not always there, but that we need to advocate for. I think we have raised issues about the importance to underline the human rights aspects and argument for why they need to be changed, but also the economic argument. I think to really highlight, and I think EIGE has done a fantastic work in highlighting actually the cost of gender inequality and also the cost of violence against women, but also about the need for cultural change. I mean, at the end of the day, this is something that we also need to bring to our young people, to make change of attitude in society. It does matter. And just to mention one example, Sweden has had a feminist foreign policy for a long time, and we were the first country that had a feminist foreign policy. And I would argue that it actually brought about change. People were very skeptical about it. We are doing gender equality, so why do we need to call it a feminist foreign policy? But I would argue it really changed minds, and particularly also actually with some male colleagues who perhaps were not as keen, and also some women, that they realized that they had a responsibility. And I think so changing the sort of mindset is really critical. Another thing that I really hope that this conference has given you, this opportunity to exchange experiences and also to network, because at the end of the day, we need to do this work together. And I hope that meeting here yesterday and today has also enabled you to make new contacts and that you can build on these partnerships. And I think if we together could work towards the establishment of an EU Eastern Partnership network, including both civil society and state actors, I think then we have come a long way and we can continue this process of exchanging. So let us please all look forward and sort of take energy from meeting here in Vilnius so that we can go forward. And I think the good news is that it's the Spanish will take over the EU presidency after the summer, and we know that Spain is a strong advocate for these questions as well. So I have strong confidence that the Spanish presidency will continue this work. So with that, thank you all for coming today.